You can kind of hold it up to the camera
Okay.
right here. Let me,
These close.
yeah, it stays so small, but. All right. Thank you, Donald, and I'll let you have it from here.
No problem. Thanks very much. I'm really glad to get a chance to talk about entomology again, one of my favorite subjects. I'm an entomologist in triplicate. I started in my undergraduate as an entomologist, plant pathologist at the University of Delaware. And then I did my master's at UT in entomology and plant pathology. And then I finished up with my PhD at Auburn University in entomology and did some of my field research in Cameroon in West Central Africa as part of a USAID project. We were working with insect pests of black-eyed pea, which is a very, very important protein crop there, and had some really interesting experiences with that too. Then I went on and did a postdoc at Mississippi State University and was working with them for a while. And they had a small university nearby called Delta State University. So I taught there in a biology department after I got done my postdoc. And then when this position came open, I was able to come back to Tennessee. I was really glad to. So anyway, I'm really glad to be here. I teach and am the chair at Austin Peay State University Department of Agriculture. One department with many different things under the same roof, including agribusiness, ag science, sustainable development, and a variety of veterinary types of things. But I teach a variety of courses that are similar to things that folks in Master Gardeners might have some interest in. So if anybody has an interest, they can touch base with me about this afterwards. Plant pathology, I do that every other spring. I taught that last spring, plant disease and plant disease control and those sorts of things. And I'll be coming back here in November to talk about plant diseases and how to things that we can do to at least mitigate some of their impacts. And then economic entomology, I'll teach that next fall. That's coming up then. This semester, I'm teaching weed science, dealing with how to identify and manage weed populations in particularly, in agricultural and other environments as well. And from time to time, they let me do fruit and vegetable crops and tobacco and grain. I'll do this one, the grain crops part of that in the spring. And every spring, I also do forestry. So they have me doing wearing a lot of different hats. Ordinarily, those would be different departments at UT, but at Austin Peay, they have us be generalists. And so I like that. That keeps me on my toes. So today, though, I'm going to be talking about aspects of entomology that are going to be important for master gardeners. And I'm going to use this talk that let's see, how do I get this to move? I'm not sure. What's my moving this thing forward? Is there some?
How do you advance slide?
Well, don't have that quite yet, but we will find a way. I've been trying those and they don't seem to want to work.
Uh-oh. Well.
So which one did you press? This one?
Yeah.
And then what did you press here or just that button?
I just kind of did like that, just kind of wipe it
All right,
open.
good.
There you go.
So we'll go back step. So
Okay.
This is a talk that Amy Dismukes, who is an extension agent before, set this up. And so I'm basically taking this was from at least from what I got from a previous Master Gardener thing. And I've modified it a little bit because there's some other things I think that are be important to add to it. But she called it the good, bad, ugly of the insect world. And one of the things we're talking about are critters that have been around or in ancestral form for a very, very long time on this earth. They're some of the most successful of organisms and groups of organisms that we've ever had on the earth. That includes some of their similar so cousins to them that were around 440 million years ago. That's a trilobites. So you may be familiar with some of those. Those were some of the first arthropods in the ancient seas. They were all marine critters. But a series of other organisms, so like trilobites are extinct, so they're no longer with us. But insects are not. They are numerous. Now, this is one that goes way, way back to the days of the Carboniferous, so very, very large wingspan. Some of these dragonflies may have had wingspans of a couple of feet back in the day. So what we're talking about is evidence that there was a lot more oxygen in the atmosphere, so they could be bigger like that. We are fortunate that it's only 21% or so oxygen, so that we don't have to deal with critters that big. Insects and these other arthropods just don't have the ability to get that big because they get too big for their breathing apparatus.
But
So-
weren't humans as big
Say-
as well?
Say again?
Like if the insects were magnified that big because of the oxygen in the earth, and why not humans being
Well,
massive?
we're talking about times far before the humans and those primates. We're talking about way back, a very, very long time ago. So as far as that goes, that was some of the, we had some larger insects, but over time, the atmosphere and those sorts of things changed. We're now at 21% oxygen, and we have insects to deal with. There are some big ones, particularly in the tropics, but we really don't have anything like there used to be those size. The thing that insects have done, though, is they've gotten small and they can fit in so many different niches. They're going to find different ways to feed in so many different places. Because of their size, they don't have to have lots of food or lots of space, and they can get their livelihoods done in relatively short time. They have found ways to evolve and adapt to just about every environment in the terrestrial world. Not much in the marine world. That's the purview of, say, the crustaceans and some of the other critters in the saltwater areas. But they are terrestrial, and they are the dominant life force on Earth, even though sometimes we don't like that so much. But we talk about 2 million species. That's a lot of critters. Insects themselves evolved off of a different branch in the animal kingdom, some of the invertebrates. And this is not the best of illustrations, but it's one that they had there. So vertebrates, of course, those with backbones, the fish, birds, amphibians, mammals, and reptiles, and a variety of other organisms. Arthropods are one of many invertebrates, and there's a whole series of other critters that are associated. Some that you may be familiar with, like millipedes. Sometimes they can be pests, not very much in agricultural settings. Centipedes, which are predators that feed on other critters. Arachnids like spiders and mites, ticks. Crustaceans, we're very familiar with those. Some of them are very delicious and tasty. I'm from the Chesapeake Bay country, and so crabs, blue crabs, are one of the most favorite delicacies that we have out there. And then insects, that's part of this. The actual tree of this most recently is showing genetically that insects are an offshoot of the crustaceans. They're basically, in essence, land crustaceans that evolved very, very different ways. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the classes of insects, I don't know if they cover this much in the actual stuff, but this is what Amy put up there for her stuff. But the classes are the centipedes, the chilopoda, which means there's a whole. They have 2 sets of legs per body segment. And so they're like the waves of motion. It's like when you see their little legs go, it's kind of like these long waves of motions they move along. They're wonderful little critters that are mostly herbivores. They're not going to mess with you too much, other than if you try to eat them, they'll exude cyanide, a cyanide kind of toxin, so that birds and other things don't eat them. That's what they develop. Then that's centipedes, sorry, that's chilopods, that's millipedes. Centipedes, though, have 1 pair of legs per body segment, and they have this jaws that go chasing after other critters. They're predators, extraordinary predators, and they also have a little bit of venom to them too, so they can be a little obnoxious and sting you and stuff like that. Symphylans are another group that we're about. Crustacea, we're pretty familiar with crabs, lobsters, and shrimp. I'll show you one land crustacean that we're all familiar with in a minute. And then insects, insecta, the class insecta, and arachnida, spiders and mites. Now, some taxonomy has adjusted and changed to make it, some may call it subclasses or superclasses, but this is what we're going to kind of go with for this. Let me go back up here. So this group here, the multi-legs, the myriapods, that's the millipedes that have 2 pairs of legs per body segment. They usually find them in kind of moist areas where there's going to be mosses and other kinds of vegetation that they're going to kind of chew through and get nutrition out of that. And of course, like everything else, they poop. And so they put that out into the soil. They break stuff down, help break stuff down. They're shredders that help break some of that material down. Centipedes, though, they're predators. They're going to go after things. You can see they're look pretty intimidating. I think it's not a bad idea not to try to handle them too much, because they can get a little active. And then symphylans, there's other similar cousins to those. Let's see if I can. Okay, so arachnids, though, I think we're pretty familiar with some of these. Some of these give us definite cause to pause. We're kind of trying to reach down and get something. If we see a spider, we usually kind of let that spider be, because each of the spiders have some abilities to defend themselves. And so some of them have tremendous abilities to defend themselves, like black widows and brown recluse. Spiders are one of those. They're 8-legged. We also have, unfortunately, ticks. That is quite a pestiferous problem. We've got this new pest species of tick in Tennessee called the Tennessee longhorn tick, or the Asian longhorn tick, that has been found down in Williamson County and down that way in Murray County. That's a problem. So there's a series of ticks. I'm not here to talk about ticks and all that stuff here today because they're not as big of an issue in gardens. Mites sometimes can be a problem. Sometimes they can be a pest. This is a velvet mite, red velvet mite. There's a series of different kinds that can cause trouble to leaves and vegetation. And scorpions don't cause trouble to vegetation, but they can be good predators in some places. We have a few of these in some of the mountain regions, the centroides species. You don't find many centipedes, scorpions in Tennessee. But the arachnids are 8-legged and they don't have antennae because they have different ways of sensing their environment. And vast majority of these are either predators or parasites. They're going to either feed directly on things and eat them, or drink the juices or secretions out of hosts, things like that. We don't really have as much issue, like I mentioned, other than mites that cause some trouble in agricultural settings. Mostly spiders are beneficials. They're really great at attacking all kinds of pest species. And if you've got pretty decent spider component, you can have a bunch of insects that are controlled that way. It's not foolproof and it doesn't stop every single thing. It's a little bit more like the lions and the wildebeest type of thing in those settings. You usually have fewer lions than wildebeest, in the environment, but that's, they're pretty good at what they do. Then the crustaceans, of which the group Pancrustacea is the large group that includes insects. These are critters that have different sets of legs. Some of them are called decapods. They have 10 pairs of legs. Others kind of have different forms of themselves: lobsters, shrimp, crabs. And then this one, some people call this the pill bug. What do they call this around here? Roly-poly. That's a southern term that you hear about that. There's also sow bug. Out in the West, they call it potato bug. In Britain, there's about 25 different names, like crunchy bats and billy bongs and stuff like that. They have, for this same critter, there's a lot of common names for this thing, because everybody, they're kind of cute and they don't do much. Other than they're really useful in ecosystems. They're good at shredding a lot of vegetation and stuff like that, and breaking it down, of course, pooping, making part of that organic matter. Shredders are actually very valuable in ecosystems because they're just a part of it, particularly in the forest ecosystem. You can find a bunch out there in the moisture. They don't like it really dry. You don't find many things that way. Anyway, I talk about crustaceans because insects, at least the most scientific evidence, shows that insects are basically offshoots of the crustacean. The molecular evidence shows that with closest genetic affinities to a host of these, let's see, you look up here, these are all crustaceans along here, and then these are some relatives to those that are freshwater crustaceans that don't look a whole lot like crustaceans, and then the insect lineages that are closely affiliated with them. So whatever it is, there is also, back in the ancient days, one of the offshoots of the dinosaurs were these feathered dinosaurs that could fly called birds. They survived, and they're an offshoot of that. Insects are in some way a similar sort of offshoot of the crustacean, but they're terrestrial almost exclusively, and not much. You find a few that are near saltwaters, but that's the thing. They have taken over the lands. So you don't have to memorize all that, but that's a publication that was in Nature, one of the top science journals. And so it's fascinating stuff. There's so much diversity with these critters. The most diverse group of anything that's ever existed on the earth, at least as far as the evidence shows. We've got 2 million species, something along those lines. So you have everything from walking sticks, earwigs, stoneflies, crickets, dragonflies. This is an insect but it's covered with a wax called a scale. You may have seen them in gardens, but it's a little sucking insect. Really primitive silverfish. These are bad. They like to drink. They like to feed, like the head lice likes to feed on human heads, and then there's others that are vector diseases. Ants, the Hymenoptera, beetles, most diverse of all things. And true bugs that have kind of a half-hard shell on them to protect themselves. Of course, beautiful butterflies. This one is not so beautiful if you want to raise cabbages, things like that. Thrips, which are a teeny tiny eyelash-sized critter that likes to scrape the leaf surfaces off and drink the juice out of it. And then fleas, of course, we know about those. Known about them for a long time. So that's just a sampling of this. At the end of this, I'm going to show you a link to a North Carolina state entomology thing for important orders for gardeners, things like that. There's a whole list like that. I couldn't find one. There was one that we used to have at UT, and they changed the addresses at one point. And so, but there's one at NC State. I'll show you at the end of this. But anyway, lots and lots of diversity of species, 2 million species. Nothing else even comes close to the insects. Of all the plants on Earth, there's roughly 500,000 species. Here we're talking 2 million and maybe more. When I worked with the Smithsonian entomologist right out of school, I was a lab tech. I met Terry Irwin, and he told us that he thought that there may be, from his studies in the rainforest, that there might be 10 million species total. Now that's a little, it's turned out to be a little bit exuberant, in its approach, but only there's probably somewhere along at least 2 million of these species. Just so many of them that can fit into so many niches. They also have this thing that they've got that we call cold-blooded, but it's not exactly cold-blooded, but what it is they have to depend upon the external temperatures and things like that for them to move around. So in the cold of January, most of our insects are fast asleep in the soil or gone. They can't take that kind of cold. And that's why we don't see them as much, in that time of year. But there are, if you peel back the layers of the leaf litter in the forest, you'll see there'll be a bunch of little critters that are making their living decomposing some of the vegetation, stuff like that. They have an open circulatory system, which is kind of weird. But if you think about this, they have an exoskeleton. Theirs is like a shield of armor, but a very lightweight shield of armor, not nearly as thick as, say, like a clamshell or something like that. Those are much heavier. But exoskeletons have been, and a flexible exoskeleton made of chitin allows them to have a lightweight, flexible, and yet defensive armor that they do. But when that's the case, their muscles and other tissues are on the inside. So what do they say? If we hit a windshield, we will go splat crunch. And if an insect hits a windshield, they'll go crunch splat, something like that. So anyway, I don't mean to make light of that, but that's a way to talk to elementary school kids, and they can get that one. Body is composed of 3 divisions. Probably insects may have been more multi-segmented, similar to, say, millipedes or things like that in some of their ancestral forms. But these guys have adapted to those segments to be specialized in head, thorax, and abdomen, classic insect components. So the head for sensation, the mouth parts are there and all that stuff. This section, the thorax, lots of musculature for legs and wings if they're adults. And then abdomen for all those critical metabolic features and reproductive components for that. The thorax has 3 segments on it, and that's where you have 3 pairs of legs. So when you look at millipedes, they got legs all on every one of these segments, things like that. Insects basically simplified that process down to 6, because if you've got 6 legs and you're walking around, at any one time, you're probably on at least 3. You have a tripod, so you can go tripod, tripod, tripod. Like basically the way that they move these legs allows them stability. And whatever it is, nature seemed to run with that. That plan worked very well for insects, the 6-leggeds. It works, well for the 8-leg plan, works very well for spiders, but this one worked very well for the most diverse of all things. And so their wings are attached. If they have wings, they usually have 2 pairs of them. or at least one pair in the true flies, they've got one pair of wings, things like that. Some insects don't have any, like a silverfish, some of the more quote unquote primitive ones. And fleas are cousins to flies, and they lost their wings so they could parasitize animals and things like that. And the one thing that's crucial to insects is one pair of segmented antennae that allows them to sense, smell, taste the whole world. That's what they're doing. They can smell, taste, in essence, through that. They can pick it up through air or in water or on the ground, whatever it is. They usually use them very well to determine the things that are important in their lives. Where's that smell from that wonderful, delicious cucumber plant that I'm going to go fly to as a spotted cucumber bee, or the tomato? Let's see, some certain tomato species of pests. They're going to go focus in on that. Their antennae are going to do it. Tomato hornworm is going to go after those. Each one of them kind of has their own uses for their antennae. Or for the pheromones, the males are going to find pheromones of females, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of chemistry that goes on with these critters and how they're attracted to things. And one pair of compound eyes, depending upon the species, some of them may be very large, like a dragonfly with the whole head. Some are much smaller, particularly for the larvae. They don't have need as many of those multiple compound eyes, but it means they've got multiple lenses. So when you look at a dragonfly, just like dozens and dozens, even maybe 100 or more of these compound eyes that give them continuous feed of some of the most sensitive visual predators that we have. Dragonflies are incredible in that they're just like on the wing. Anything that moves, they're going to be able to go after and find it. At nighttime, though, they don't do so well because they can't see, in that regard. Other species have developed other methods, like praying mantises have ability to see in the low light levels and stuff like that. A couple of other things, and you can ask me questions. Sometimes I get revved up and rolling. She's got a bunch of slides that make sure I get covered. But when you look at the internal portions of the insect, and you can see the head, thorax, where the wings and legs are, and the abdomen, there is a long digestive tract. That's the thing that we're probably dealing with the most when they're coming into gardens, is they're eating our gardens. They're going to chew that and go through whatever their digestive tract is. And there's 2 million different stories as to how they do that, or something like that. So they can, they've got mouth parts at the top of the head here that are different species have different kinds. Some are really good at chewing, but it's not like us with one mandible. They've got 2 mandibles here and other components where they put like almost 6 of these things together to chew and masticate and bring that inside. It's a completely different world when you're talking about insects with that. Some of them have modified their mouth parts over time to be a drinking tube or a drinking straw. Like a butterfly drinks out of nectar. Others, though, like some of these stink bugs, are penetrating the plant, drinking the plant juice out of it with this kind of long stylet that they're going to feed off of. And then digestive tract, they got a nervous tract. Their nervous tract, like us, we're vertebrates. Our nervous tract is our backbone. Their nervous tract is underneath. It's a whole different way of interacting with the world. This is their open-hearted system, and a kind of loose heart, if you will, with open holes that pump blood throughout this cavity in the body. And it's not like us with oxygen blood. It's a food blood. It's a very different kind of thing. They actually have to breathe through these things called spiracles, which are air tubes that start with holes in each of their sides, and then it gets to the rest of their body. It's the reason why we don't have the giant praying mantis eating with Cincinnati or something. There's nothing like that. There's insects that were that large, couldn't get enough oxygen, and they would just not have, they just never were able to develop that big. And we are very fortunate for that, because I wouldn't want to have to deal with, insects that big. But they're supremely good at what they do in that micro world that they're in. They're just really, they're perfectly well adapted to eat our gardens. Yes, that's what they will do sometimes. Now, they don't all do that. Some of them are great beneficials that will attack the predators, and some are other things. That diversity, this is something about that diversity again. So beetles are the most numerous of any order of animals on Earth. So at least probably now they're saying about 500,000 of those, something along those lines. This says 400,000. Flies are very, very numerous as well. Lots and lots of different kinds of flies, species. wasps, bees, and ants. There's a whole lot of those. This number is growing because we find a series of these wasps that will go and attack other critters like caterpillars that lay their eggs inside, feed on them, and pop out like alien. Unfortunately, that helps us control insects. And then butterflies and moths, so numerous, and they're pretty sometimes in their beautiful arrays of Tennessee butterflies and moths. We'll get a chance to come up and look at these here. I guess I'll show this to the camera. We have a collection. This is one of our amateur collectors brought in this one. There's some amazingly beautiful butterflies and things. Every one of those, though, has a larva that will probably feed on some kind of plant growth. And that's where it comes into us with gardens and things like that, because we have some very hungry caterpillars out there that like to chew on that. True bugs, not as many of those species, but they can become problems. That's stink bugs and a variety of other critters that are going to be drinking plant juice. And then the aphids and scale insects, these can cause compounded problems because they can suck the juice out of plants and vector diseases and viruses. Aphids are really good, unfortunately, at doing that because they can cycle the virus through them and pass it on to your plants. So sometimes in plant pathology, that's the only way to control a virus is to control the insect vector. So that's just a few of the critters that may be important in gardens. There's some others. These are some other types of homopteran insects that are pests. There's a whitefly there that can be big problems in greenhouses and stuff like that. So lots of little critters. There's some scale insects. We'll get a chance to see it. I've got a whole series of scale insects over here that you can come and look up. We take a break. Let's see. What else have we got? There's some other scale insects there. Now, insects themselves have some dramatic transformative abilities to change their stages from something that looks completely unlike what it ends up as. And we're all familiar with the very hungry caterpillar spinning its cocoon chrysalis here. This is anybody know what this is? Monarch, yeah, monarch butterfly. There's the larva as it's finished its feeding and it's setting itself, spinning this chrysalis. Eventually, it spends a lot of time transforming from this feeding tube or something like that, just an eating machine, to a reproductive, this amazingly beautiful critter that is reproductive. And so they'll emerge from that. We're familiar with that metamorphosis and those sort of things. And a lot of insects will follow that kind of basic growth stage transformation. So things like the complete metamorphosis of butterflies, fleas, flies, wasps, beetles, all kinds of insects go through this. They call it complete metamorphosis because they'll start out as an egg, they'll emerge. Sometimes those little first stage larvae will feed on the egg case because they'll get a little nutrients and then they'll go feed on the plant. Then they'll molt because when you have an exoskeleton, you have to shed that skin in order to grow. Otherwise, you get to a certain point, you eat and you can't grow anymore. You're not going to be able to develop into adulthood. So they'll go switch to one from one instar to a next. In the first molt, the second molt, third stage larva, and the third molt, fourth stage larva, and then some of them will go through 5 stages of larva, and then finally produce this pupa or cocoon. We call them pupa because that's the most common things. Because some will spin a full cocoon, others will just have this kind of hard shell. So, and then the dramatic transformation that happens when they go from this wormy looking thing to this incredible flying adult insect. It's an amazing transformation that occurs through a series of hormonal changes and a cascade of biological stuff that I'm not going to get into detail on. That's complete metamorphosis, where they're transforming from egg, larva, pupa, adult. Then you have other insects that just go through a relatively gradual or quote unquote incomplete metamorphosis to where they start out of the hatching from the egg. So if a grasshopper nymph or a cricket nymph, it looks a lot like an adult. So you have the same sort of legs and head versus you look back at this, and this is a completely different looking thing than this, even though the body shows a similarity in kind of its slenderness. it's just completely different. When you see, it looks very different, even though it starts from all that same sort of tissue. With grasshoppers and crickets, they really just kind of get larger. And then eventually they'll get their wings and their last molt. They'll sometimes have these little wing pads. You'll see immature grasshoppers out this time of year, and they don't have the fully extended wings, but they're eaten, and then they'll molt and become, go through several molts with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like the 6th one here. That becomes the adult. And it has full wings, so it takes off and fly to next place.
So how big do these get?
Grasshoppers, most of the grasshoppers around here aren't going to be too bad. We may have a few that'll be the size of like your finger spread, something like that. There's some big ones occasionally. There's some really big ones that are migratory locusts and stuff like that we don't really have much here, but they did in parts of Africa where I was, and they're very large. They can sometimes be, many inches long, things like that. However, most of those grasshoppers aren't going to be that big. Mostly we're dealing with smaller things that, maybe a few inches at most, but they're really good with their chewing mouthparts at just devouring lots of vegetation. So anyway, that's grasshoppers. There are many species that go through this similar type of gradual metamorphosis. It's just a generalized thing. True bugs go through that. Aphids go through this kind of transformation. A whole host of insects go through this gradually, versus so cockroaches and dragonflies and earwigs, versus the complete metamorphosis where butterflies, flies, wasps, beetles, all those are going to go through those kinds of transformations. So that's part of that. Now, some critters can actually birth live young. Mostly they're laying eggs first, but occasionally you'll get some like this aphid female right now is live birthing her offspring. This is a type of aphid species that in the fall will go to a sexual reproduction stage where there's actually males of that species that will reproduce and breed with it. However, during the summer months, when they're going into hyperdrive and feeding a lot and reproducing, they have all that they need to reproduce the next generation without males. They're parthenogenic. So they have, instead of an XY or an X chromosome, they have an X blank. And it allows them to reproduce within just a few days. This one reproduces inside it. It has the embryo of the next generation ready to go. So in a short amount of time, you can have leaves covered with aphids, sucking all the juice. Yes, question.
Why does the male go?
Well, there's many very important reasons, because when you only have half the chromosomes, you're vulnerable in nature to disease and other things like that. So diversity in genetics is strength, because you have the greater diversity, generally speaking, you have the ability to overcome all these slings and arrows that nature throws at you. They sacrifice that for rapid reproduction and taking over an area. But at a certain time in the hot, humid conditions, there are certain fungi that will come in and wipe them out because they only have half the chromosomes. But whatever it is, nature kind of works with this system, and it works very well for a lot of aphids. And for us, unfortunately, they can take over pretty rapidly. Then at a certain time, this time of year, usually when the day length gets shorter, some of the offspring produced are males, and then they will mate with females and produce the classic type of the classic thing of half the chromosomes from the male, half the chromosomes from the female. Parthenogenesis is somewhat rare in the animal kingdom, but it works unfortunately too well for these aphids. Parthenogenesis, that's how they say that. Anyway, so some of them will do that, but mostly it's those previous models I mentioned of either gradual metamorphosis or complete metamorphosis. All right, so why in the heck are we talking about insects? I'm sure that you all have had insects that have caused some kind of problem for others, right, in gardens. But one of the things we forget, though, is these pollinators, there's so many of these things that are working overtime to help make sure that we have squash and cucumbers and pumpkins and all kinds of stuff, sunflowers and everything. They are essential. They've become essential ever since the time of the dinosaurs. Flowering plants evolved to produce some of the most important plants in agriculture. And so there's many reasons why to care about insects. I'm an entomologist, of course, I've got, even more than that, but we have to be concerned about pest nature, but also some beneficial. So we'll talk about that. In fact, we have many different beneficial services provided by these insects. So the pollinators, of course, and honey and all those sorts of things. Scarab beetles, Egyptians venerated them so highly because they thought they were rolling the ball of the sun across the sky and other things like that. However, they're critical for taking dung and putting it underground and fertilizing the ground underneath. Keeping something that would just be kind of nasty and fly infested, they take it underground and it becomes nutrients for plant roots, things like that. So when you have pastures and things like that, where you've got these waste management scarab beetles, they're really good at recycling, nature's recyclers. And then, of course, we have in gardens, we'll have these critters, lady beetles, devouring a lot of insects. Those aphids that multiply so rapidly, once the lady beetles get there, they start mowing them down and they'll lay their eggs and their larvae just look like these massive alligators chomping down on these poor little aphids, which I don't have a lot of sorrow for with that. So when it comes to that, but there's a lot of different ways that insects are beneficial. In fact, they are the underpinnings of all of our ecosystems, including ag ecosystems. If they were to go away, we'd be in big trouble because we wouldn't have pollinators, we wouldn't have a lot of delicious things to eat, and we'd have collapse of our ecosystems. They're fundamental to them. Unfortunately, they can also explode in population, so we're familiar with that. We have massive pests. Many insects are beneficial. The pollination is really critical. Most non-grass crops require that. Let me get all the pictures going here before I start talking. So pollination is really important. Lots of useful products like honey, silk is produced by insects. Various different dyes like cochineal scale are the brilliant crimson red kinds of colors of dyes are produced by insects. Certain types of shellac, lacquer were produced originally by scale insects, and a whole bunch of other products like that. They also are really good at controlling other insects. There's nothing better many times than to have predators and parasitoids attack your pest species. And then there are also decomposers. But there's also this thing that animals have been doing is feeding off of these critters for a very long time, including chickens who love them. They're devourers of insects, and they get better egg qualities and things like that if they've got, this omnivorous diet that they have, part of it. They're also actually can be used for a variety of things, for fish food and all kind of reptile food. People see that sort of thing. Thing is, though, humans have been at least taking part in eating some types of insects over a very long part of our history, according to the archaeological evidence. And people are still eating that in some places. These are fried bamboo boars. Walk here, and there's some edible insects there, like giant water bugs and stuff like that. But more than 2 billion people choose to eat insects on a regular basis, partially in the tropics where there's so many of them. It's a protein source that's going to become more important as the world goes from 8 billion to 10 billion. When you have that kind of thing. So this is in China. This is in Mexico, the Chapelinas. This is in Israel. By the way, it's part of the Bible, Leviticus. Of these, you may eat those that go on 4 legs with 2 of their abdomens, which includes grasshoppers, crickets, and locusts. So that's in Leviticus. And let's see, what was John the Baptist? What did he? Anybody know? Locusts and wild honey. So anyway, so he read his Leviticus or something like that. But people have been eating insects for a very long time, and they have certain types of nutrition. Now, I've eaten some too, and I haven't died, but I always cook them. I don't do insect sushi. And there's certain species that are better than others. I would never eat a cockroach, but crickets and cricket powder can be made into these bars and stuff like that. So this is a side research thing that I've done for many years, but it's something that, folks were worried that was going to be, they're going to replace all your food with it. It's not going to be that thing. We have to continue to produce protein crops for protein livestock for cows, pigs, chickens, all those sorts of types of meat. But the world is going to increase by that amount. We're probably going to have to add protein sources. So not either or, but yes, and I guess is the way that they're talking about. So worldwide, there's a lot of research going into that. I've been to several different conferences that have been related to that. And when I was in Africa, there were several places where folks were cooking certain types of insects that were delicacies. And, you know, as a Chesapeake Bay crab eater, I can understand. I eat arthropods. You know, I don't mind them. Just always cook them and make sure that you know what you're doing with this. But anyway, that's a side note. This isn't why we're here. We're going to talk about garden stuff. So there are problems with insects. Why are we studying them? They can cause damage and problems to people. They can directly attack by biting, venomization. That can be terrible. If you've got some kind of anaphylactic response to them, this can be deadly. You know, some of these responses. Some of them also can vector diseases like the lice, fleas that was responsible for the great, you know, the bubonic plague, those sort of things. Mosquitoes kill more humans than just about anything else, any other animal. The most deadly and devastating because of vectoring so many diseases, yellow fever and malaria, so many things. And the brutality of those is that they kill a lot of children under the age of 5. You know, they're just, it's so, you know, they're a force to be reckoned with, and we have to try to find ways to manage them. At least we can't eradicate them per se. You know, people might like to, but we can manage them so that they're within safer numbers. They're also devastating to certain livestock and pets. We had recently some goats at the Austin P farm, and we had mites that were feeding all over them and causing problems. We had to give them a sulfur bath and stuff to treat that. They're also damaging to houses, clothing, and stored products. You know, termite inspection and those sorts of things are a very important part of keeping our households going and keeping. The thing about the termites are they're an offshoot of the cockroach group that really developed on feeding on wood, old dead wood. They're very important in a forest environment to break down parts of wood. They and their microbial allies are really critical in doing that. However, we don't want them eating our houses. So there's a lot of pest management related to that, trying to reduce some of the impacts of those. And then, of course, for this particular course, we're going to be talking about plants. They can devastate and damage plants, including crop plants, forests, ornamental plants, turf, you know, so many different things that they can do with that. They can do all kinds of things. They can have either rasping or scratching or egg laying, stippling, leaf binding, wilts, chewing, galls, all kinds of stuff, boring into these plants. You know, there's many different ways that they damage and devastate our plants. That's the next sort of thing we're going to go into, is to talk about the damage that they cause. Before I do that, are there any other questions about the insect introduction? Okay, so that clock is about right. I think I'll start with some of the damage, and we'll take a break after that. Okay, so a lot of these critters are chewing insects. The very hungry caterpillar has chewing mouthparts. Grasshoppers do. Beetles do. There's a caterpillar. They basically have a couple of big mandibles that are really good at breaking down plant material and then chopping it up further so they can digest it. And so when you see these critters, they're going to leave certain types of holes. Like this one here, you can see it probably from the back of your seat. This ordinarily kind of rounded leaf is completely cut by a leaf cutter bee. They took those to kind of sequester for their offspring in their nests. But that should be kind of rounded. I don't have another one like that, but that should be kind of nice and rounded, and it is not. It's definitely chewed up on that. And there's a variety of different ways. Sometimes there's holes, perforations, or sometimes they will skeletonize leaves, do all kinds of things like that with their chewing mouthparts. There's some holes in some rhododendrons and there's some grasshoppers mowing down some other plants and stems. Caterpillars, they like to feed on that. I think this used to be some kind of cucurbit leaf. It's all devastated and damaged and fed on. And let's see, there's some others. So these are going to be kind of scraping off some of those, the surface of the leaf like that. That's what these little leaf beetles are doing in that case. And that's, you know, you may see this on trees and stuff like that, where they're taking all that rich nutrient that the plant has produced and turning it into bug bodies with that. Insect bodies. So that's the chewing mouthparts side of the equation. Then there is this other major mode of feeding called sucking insects, sucking mouthparts. And I don't know, you want to mark or something? Oh, here we go, here's one. So basically, so the mandibles I'm talking about are something like this. You may see cartoon characters like this. That's sort of the chewing mouthparts. And then there's kind of the front of the head with the eyes and the antennae and all that stuff. That's a chewing mouthpart. Some insects, though, have got a little different setup, and they will have this long, their mandibles, in this case, are modified into sucking mouthparts. And so they'll penetrate into the plant, and then they'll start drinking the plant juice out of those plant veins. So they're going to suck the juice out of that plant and cause, can cause some real problems. It can cause wilting of plants sometimes. You get that many aphids reproducing rapidly, you'll see the leaves start to curl up and wilt and stuff like that. So sucking insects. So this is a plant bug here. There's a leaf hopper. There's an aphid drinking plant juice. There's a stink bug. And these are little tiny series of different kinds of insects that are part of the Homopteran group that are feeding on things like that. Others are going to cause some different kinds of things. So this one here would have been a nice green leaf, but there's probably some other critters that were feeding on this and basically taking a lot of the chlorophyll out, taking all that rich nutrition and not leaving much for the plant in that case. Some of them can really cause some damage. So this is a tomato that's had a lot, like this time of year, a lot of stink bugs are out feeding on them. They'll perforate and penetrate those and cause damage to them. This one is an interesting insect. It's called a thrips. So thrips is plural. It's also singular. The thrips have got a combination of these mouthparts. One of them kind of rasps like this on the leaf, and the other is more of a stylet that kind of sucks it up. So it has a unique kind of mouthpart system. They're tiny, but if they hit your little flowers or developing buds, they can scrape and suck the juice out of that and really cause some trouble to plants. Sometimes, especially when they're in their tender kind of growing stages, that can be a real problem on developing floral buds, and that's a problem if you're trying to produce fruits and things. This is the immature version of that thrips, and then there's the adult version of the things. But they're really small. It's hard to see. You almost need little hand lens to see some of those on a plant, because some of them are the size of an eyelash, some are a little bigger than that, but they're little teeny tiny critters that they're not going to be like grasshoppers or something like that. You have to look up close for them. And unfortunately, we don't see them a lot of times. So they're going to feed on leaves and really kind of damage and scrape and drink the juice of them. And so here's what that damage looks like. So you have this kind of curling leaf system, and this one's on the actual fruits themselves. That strips damage to that. There's damage to flowers. It's not going to be a very marketable flower. Here's you can see that they've scraped a bunch of these ornamentals as well. And let's see what else. Yeah, there's some now these are critters, a little bit different critters. It's not exactly thrips in this case. These are ones that get inside the leaf. A lot of times we think a leaf is a true flat surface, but you probably have learned that there are multiple cell layers in a leaf. You'll have the epidermis section with all those cells up here, and then you have all of these wonderful photosynthetic cells, and then a bunch down here. You have a bunch of layers, then you have a bottom layer like that. So these critters get in and feed on all that rich nutrition. And that's what's happening there. They're really damaging inside the leaf here, devouring the inside parts of it. Sometimes you don't see them until it's kind of too late with some of those critters. Sometimes there'll be leaf miners that will move through those leaves as well. This is a midge species that its larvae will feed on those leaves and cause trouble. Here's one that is, this is what's called a leaf miner, kind of crawls through the interior portions, the sandwich that is that leaf, and feeds on the little cells. So it's a tiny insect, skinny, able to fit inside this leaf and kind of feed through here. And this one may have started out here as small, you notice is it started molting, got bigger, and it got bigger. So basically you can see the pathway gets a little larger as it gets longer.
How old was that?
This one is probably going to be a few weeks to do something like that. Some may go faster than that, but like you'll start to see, you won't really see it, and then all of a sudden you'll kind of make some of those leaf mines. They are, they're taking all that stuff out of that interior portion, then eventually they're kind of protected because they're not immediately visible by predators in that case. So it's a food way, and it's also a way to kind of keep them out of being devoured on the surface of something like that.
Because the gardener who saw that, fluff the leaf and.
That's one way to do it. That's one way to do it. If you have a small enough set of plants, sometimes you get a lot of them out there, and there may be sometimes folks in larger vegetable production systems or ornamentals may have to use systemic insecticides to reach them, because otherwise they can't. They're hard to get. When they're stuck in between that leaf, they're not going to be exposed to whatever we are doing, whether it's organic or synthetic. So those kind of things. So there's some of that. Here's one that really is pretty advanced. There's some beautiful patterns, but not if you're trying to raise that plant. It's not very beautiful. Anyway, just like everything else, you see sort of you can see their kind of fecal matter as they're going through it, but that's what they're doing, feeding on all that rich plant matter. Now, some plants can take a little bit of that damage like that and still produce a bunch of plants. Like if you have a few leaves like that, you're pretty much okay. Some of them will get a whole lot more of them, just kind of depends. There are a few little parasitic wasps that will track them down and parasitize them. So they're specialists and they're beneficials. There's also things that plants can have parts of their systems taken over by insects or mites. They can get in there and start feeding and force the plant to grow this weird nodule, things called galls. I've got a few that I'm gonna pass around here in a minute. This is a leaf gall on a maple plant, and I keep thinking this is Areophile mites, things like that would produce this thing. These little red welts are basically a place where the insect or mite has forced the plant to grow this thing that's going to produce a lot of sugar juice and also protect it from predators. So sometimes they're actually controlling the genetics of the plant to do that crazy thing. Here's the inside of some of those galls. So the insects are in here. There's a little insects feeding on it. And they basically force this plant to grow in a weird shape and structure. And it's great for the insect and not so great for the plant when it comes to that. Let's see what else. So here's some more galls on there. Irregular plant growths. There's some of the critters that will produce those sort of things. There's a phylloxeran that will cause some problems like that. This is some interesting looking galls on oak leaves. There's a wasp species that will parasitize the leaf, lay its egg in there, the larva will feed on it, force it to grow this big puffball structure. And inside is a little chamber of the little critter that's feeding on it. It keeps other predators from getting to it. And also, they can use that resource. It's great for them, not so great for the oak tree, as they say. Here's the inside of that gall. So this is the little chamber where the insect is. It's feeding, forcing that plant to feed by taking over the genetics of this. It's bizarre kind of arrangement, but it works pretty well for them. Sometimes, I think in the springtime, late spring, I'll see some of those dropping out of a tree, and you open them up and they'll look something like that. And that's not a seed, that's a little bug chamber or insect chamber in there. There's the wasp that does that. So it's not a one that's going to sting us. It's very small, non-stinging wasp, but cynipid wasp. But there's a whole host of those critters that will do this. Yes. Well, it's taking the nutrients away from it, forcing the plant to spend all its energy to produce this weird structure that's not leafy photosynthetic vegetation feeding the plant roots or things like that. It's like that. So the plant is trying, as you may know, is trying to produce all these sugars by taking carbons and making sugar chains and all that stuff. This slows that process down, complicates things, and makes it just harder to grow. If there's just a few of them on the oak tree, it's not going to be a big problem. But sometimes they can get in large numbers and cause some issues with photosynthesis or things like that. If you just have a small oak tree and a bunch of them get on there, that can compound some issues with your growth. They also get these crazy structures. I'm going to pass some of these around. These are some galls that were on oak trees. I'm going to pass some of those around. And they look really bad. I mean, but this is a wasp species that has laid its eggs inside the developing tender vegetation. I'll pass a few of these around. This one's a little bit more open. You can see the chambers. You can pass that around to folks in the back. Here's another one. And this one's kind of, I broke it open to see if you can see the chambers inside of it. Anyway, some galls like this will disrupt the function, but they started out when the plant is green and tender. So they can lay their eggs in there and the critters will feed on inside of it. As the tree starts to grow and produce woody vegetation, and they become these hard nodule things. Sometimes these can be a real problem in oak production or other types of trees. Here's the inside with all the little wasp tunnels, little immature caterpillar larvae, look like caterpillars feed on the inside. Usually they're not feeding directly on the hard wood. They're doing that when it's still soft and tender. And then when it gets to this stage, then they're ready to emerge as adults and go do the same thing. And so there's the wasp itself that does this and can cause some real problems in some of these oak trees. There is a tree that's so heavily peppered with it, they had to take it down. Just sometimes, like certain pin oak trees that you find in places are really susceptible to this particular thing. They are not a native species here, and so they're highly preferential for ornamental production and things like that, but they can run into these, and we've lost several of these on Austin Peay's campus because of this gall. There are sometimes you can use a systemic insecticide that will go up inside of the tree and kill the larvae, but many times once you get going like this and they emerge each year, it can become a problem. I have treated some trees that we've been able to arrest kind of some of the development, but when it gets like this, that's pretty much done. Yeah, that tree is done. Let's see. And so that's kind of, sometimes called gouty oak. There's gout oak galls and other wasp galls that are on those trees. Galls can be produced by other critters, including fungi and viruses, but in this case, this is insects. Insect growth. I brought another thing that I found this year when we had some outbreaks of cicadas further south of here. And I'm going to pass this around. It has kind of a series of little holes along the stem. Let's see, do I have any more of that? Well, I don't know if this one is as good. This one I have to use the microscope. But the next one I'm going to show is egg laying injury by scars. So initial stuff was happening this year in the 17-year cicadas. Metro Davidson area and Stewart County, not in Montgomery County. But they were these cicadas were laying their eggs in there when they had their mass emergence. Then when you cut this up, you can see where they've laid their eggs and eventually the larvae develop on that. And then they will emerge, those nymphs will emerge and drop down to the ground. That happened sometime probably in July or something along those lines after the big outbreak that happened in late May and June. And when that happened, you would have, sometimes you may see this kind of, where the tips of those trees really could get, damaged. Basically that part is just kind of lopped off and broken off because that's where they laid their eggs. For the most part, a large tree didn't have big trouble with this, but if you had a fresh, tender sapling that you've grown and they've laid their eggs, that can really cut back the growth on those types of plants. But this is periodical cicada, the one that we call the 13-year cicada because it comes out every 13 years. Up north, there's 17-year cicadas that look very much similar to that. They come out on a 17-year cycle. The rest of their life is underground, feeding as nymphs on the sap juice of the sap coming out of the roots of the tree.
That's where they stay for the 13 or 17 years.
Underground. Yep. And the scientists recently found that they think that they can tell the time that it is by the sap flow and the sap retreat every year. So after about 13 of those, something triggers a response in this particular species to come out and have this mass reproduction that occurs. This year, we had lots of those. We also found this one here. You can see it has, so most of them have this big red eyes. We found one of these over in Stewart County that has no color. It's basically colorless, although they call it a blue-eyed version, but it's basically just, it's the gene for coding red did not show up in that particular one. There's some, when you have a trillion of these, I think all across the eastern United States, there are a few of these, and we posted this on Cicada Mania website, and they were like, what? It was like the first one they'd seen of the year. It's a very rare, less than 1% type of thing. The thing about these critters are they have sucking mouth parts, and for the most part, the trees can make it if the little larvae or nymphs are feeding underground. They're usually not devastating the tree or things like that. But when they do this mass outbreak, you can get this, the egg laying that causes this sort of tip die off in these trees. And, for us, it's only every 13 years, so it's not as big a deal. There's another type of cicada, the dog day cicada, that we hear every year. It's kind of a greenish, brownish color or things like that. Those are going to occasionally do it, but they don't come out in the crazy mass numbers like the periodical cicada. And so there's other critters. I got to keep rolling. There's many other critters that feed by chewing mouth parts on the leaf. This is a twig girdler. Basically, it will chew on that kind of fresh growing twig section and then completely lop it off. There's some in soybeans called decti stem borer that do something similar to this, but that's in woody vegetation. And there's the larva that's on the inside of some of these will feed on the inside. And you can see that's a pretty decent sized larva that has been feeding on, generally speaking, more slender branches. The big, thick ones they don't do as well in, but they have to have some kind of thing that they can get their mouth parts to chew on. But that's, forest pests and also ornamentals pests. So trees, a variety of things suffer impacts from insects. We also have some critters that are soil livers, that live in the soil and feed on a variety of different types of things. Some of them are feeding on roots. So this one, this rhinoceros beetle and the June bug there. This one is a ground beetle. There's a dung beetle right there. Sometimes we see these kind of greenish June type beetle that are feeding on. Sometimes they'll feed on some of our plants too. A lot of these live their immature stages in the ground, or within logs or things like that. Beetles are really good at doing that, but they look very different from this kind of adult stage. Here's what those might look like. This, I think, is one of the June beetles. Here's its early stage larva. It's kind of a C-shaped larva. They have kind of a hardened head with chewing mandibles. They're going to chew on plant roots and stuff like that. And then they'll molt and grow into larger ones, and there's another even larger one there. Some of these species, the Phylophaga, will, at this time of year, like when we had a rain recently, we had some of them roll on their backs and crawl to the next place on their back because those legs like that get in the way. They can't move flat on a flat surface. They'll turn over and use kind of their muscles in those segments to move out. So if you see a critter like this, but it's on its back, that's probably one of those larger June beetles, Phylophaga June beetles that we're doing. They can cause some pest problems in the soil, with plant roots sometimes. The Japanese beetle is a particular problem, not only above ground, but below ground, because they can feed on a variety of different plant roots. There's some that are definitely chewing and lopping off vegetation that we might have had in the garden, something like that. They can do sometimes they can do those kinds of damage. And here's the Japanese beetle that starts out as eggs sometime in summer and will molt through its stages and sometimes kind of rest into a resting stage in the wintertime and then kind of pupate sometime later in the spring and then come out as adults. We're probably unfortunately too familiar with them. When I was a kid, they were all over parts of the mid-Atlantic region, And when I first got to UT to do my master's work, they were just coming into parts of Tennessee and Kentucky. But they have spread significantly, and they're further west of the Mississippi River now. And they're a big problem because they're chewing on a lot of different things and damaging rose bushes and all kinds of different things. They are anyway. That's ones that live in the soil and then will feed as larvae and feed on roots, and then adults will come out and feed on the above ground portions. Yes. Yeah. It's the variety that they have is called the Bacillus papilii. And it's good for destroying Papillia japonica, which is the Chapman's beetle. So it will destroy them. So this is a bacterial kind of dust that when it gets on those larvae, it will eventually destroy them from the inside. The thing about it is it works really well if you put it out on your lawn, it will kill the ones there. The problem is if your neighbors aren't treating it, then the adults will fly into your lawn and then feed on your plants. But what you want to do is get milky spore, as they call it, and spread it throughout the neighborhood, and you'll get some better control of the larvae from that and reduce some of the impacts. I think sometimes this is marked under milky spore, and also it's called doom. Like these companies put these names on, but it's specific to that species, which fortunately is a useful thing. It's not going to take out the dung beetles or other things like that, because it's the mechanism by which that bacteria does focuses on that, which we're fortunate. So that's another mechanism. And so where are we sitting? So I've gone through an hour so far. Is this a break time here? How are we doing as far as this goes? Break time or not break time? Keep on rolling. Break time. Okay, let's take a little break. We come up and get a look at some of these other critters here. I will also have this microscope set up so you can look at some immature, like there's some aphids under here. Some of them are alive and some of them are parasitized. If I can pull this up here. Yeah, I've got some aphids on here and some mealybugs and stuff like that. Everyone wants to see some of these. Yes. Yeah. It depends. Beautiful monarch lights attached to a branch so that predators, it has a little stem on it so that predators have a heart attack. It's on the ground, lots of other critters. It may survive, dependent, but it's many times there's a lot of stuff. But there's a bunch of different types of things I put together. I don't have all my whole. These are all like see.
I mean, interesting and pretty dull sometimes. Yeah, it is fascinating.
Well, here's some beneficial spiders. It has to do with they no longer have all those all the hemolymph blood that comes in. So basically it just sort of evaporates and it just causes shrinkage that brings the muscles. Yeah, it's sort of like there's a great far side cartoon where out on the bottom side and so but insects will do that. Now some of these we can actually we pin them, we can spread them out to dry like this right now. When they're fresh and supple, you can use them like to start from kind of look and see the flow. And this is not easy to clean. And spread the wings out of butterflies, especially if they're really dry. You have to moisten them. Here are some goggles scales. Let's see. Not quite like this intensity. I have not seen it that bad, but there are some species. And this one, I think typically is another value. But it's little scale insects look just like these little tiny scales, but underneath. Well, yeah.
And every year, like the leaves, just have all these little. It looks like egg, like in our books, we get caterpillars, but egg comes up, and that's what it looks like all over the leaves.
Are they kind of warped and curling and stuff like that? It's not leaf curl, it's just peach leaf curl sometimes can spread to other stem crops. I'm not exactly sure
And it's
what
not
that
a
called.
fruit, it's a very, I don't know if it's correct. Like, they can put it with the fruit is.
Okay, okay. You know, like a, ornamental.
It's growing great, but every time I look at that, I think it's not a good fruit.
I would have to kind of see that one. Sometimes there are fungi that do that, but it's actual you see actual insects moving. Because
I know
sometimes,
I'm into it, and it's like.
yes, some galls are insect induced, some are fungal induced. Whatever. That one, you probably bring it to parlay. That's really like intercatchers and all that, because sometimes like a picture can be worth 1,000 words. I don't know. Specific. You can probably get close to it.
Because I tried to, I think I'm missing the mark on it, so, but it kind of. But no, it's.
Those
it's
are
the-
aphids there.
Yeah, and it's.
These are pretty advanced. This is from a pretty bad gall infestation. They took this tree out when they planted it.
How can you tell?
Well, generally speaking, you'll see, yeah, I mean, if you turn over a cow flop and you see some larvae, that's probably. One of the things that we found is we used to have some, and then at the Austin Peay farm, then they got a mineral that had anti-fly properties, and that meant that the manure was treated, and so we didn't get as many. So when as many, so the flies, the flies will take over the cow pats before the dung beetles can take them on the ground. Well, that's good. If they're doing it, that helps spread it. Basically that's going to help other things break it. The more that they break that apart, the quicker that it will be on that decomposition. I mean, they're all in competition for some of the things. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think it's a big problem. I mean, like, I don't know, do you use the mineral that has that flying? Okay, that's
They try not to.
yeah, that's good. Because if you can look at, if you kind of take a stick and turn over, you may see some larvae, there's a little kind of C-shaped larvae. That's probably. And those the adults will take it underground and make a little ball to feed a delicious poo to feed their babies. They absolutely, there's a lot of nutrient in some of this. Those are aphids that some of them were parasitized by a little wasp. And some of them have a hole out of it.
I was gonna say, something has a hole with something else.
Yeah, like basically this little wasp, tiny wasp, laid its egg inside, developed, and then popped out. And that's what's left of this. Some of the aphids that were actually viable with green.
The one that's got a hole in it has something else crawling around, is looking like it's.
Oh, yeah, let's see.
A one little hole, there's like a little tiny little white thing.
Oh yeah,
Well,
there's
in and out
some
of the hole.
mealy bugs. I don't know why they would be inside. Maybe there may be mites inside there too. Something that small would probably be mite based. Let's see, I have this one here. I think we've got some white fly. Actually, these were white flies that now are taken over by fungus. That one's not. That's all debris by this point. This one may have some more white flies. Yeah, here's some white fly immatures. Yeah.
They're basically sucking the juice out of that plant.
Oh, wow.
They're so tiny that we don't see them at first.
Right.
And then they'll kind of be large enough to drain the juice out of those plants for sure. Some are nocturnal, some are diurnal. It depends on the species.
I don't see the insect on the plants.
Yeah.
But I see that it's too long, or I guess it's just been too long.
Yeah.
Is there a way or something?
There are some general patterns, like I can tell roughly what a beetle feeding looks like, or if it's a caterpillar feeding or something. Many times when I get to a plant that's already been chewed on, they're moved on to another leaf to feed on. It kind of depends, when it comes to that. If it's a really highly valued thing that because you can't afford to lose and they're trying to devour the leaf, possibly. Sometimes a little bit of damage is just not enough to merit that kind of thing. Sometimes, and then there are some species that can get out of hand. That just depends on what it is. There's you know, there's a bunch of things that she can tell you about that are really will take over. And when you ask, you have 2 million species, there's a lot of answers to that question. That's how I cover myself. Basically, you're using this probably spread this out. And that's probably the zero ones. Male is smaller. You have to be fast. Yeah, we got a lot of them. So these are all the arachnids and others that are, there's a brown food. And then there's a native Tennessee symphonia. This was from up in I don't ever see them. Oh, this thing, it's not gonna be like a bee sting or something like that, a wasp sting. It's not like the desert ones that can take that. Are they having other coloration on or is all? They were really fast flapping. Okay. There's a type of pillar wasp that has spiders. And they do that really phonetic energy, like the wings tapping everything like that. Sensitivity. Yeah.
I found a baby black widow that one day. I almost stepped on it. It did a video. I seen my red hourglass on it. I almost stepped on it. It already did. So, yeah. Talk about the same time as you did. I think it's called it.
I don't think I have a black widow in this one. Most of these are kind of big garden spiders and there's some old leaves and some other things like that.
I love the word with this wonderful, but
Yeah, there's this one that is decided to go outside on the front door if you don't use that as a. So this spins this web every night. Right between the peppers and the. Oh. Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of field crickets that are pretty big. They're all over and, you know, they're feeding on right, and some of them are on the. A lot of them like fireflies. Yeah, that's fish like that. No. There's fish there. All right. So how are we doing? Are we about ready to get back to the next phase? This is something, how long we're going until we're go till 9, I guess.
Till 9, but if you don't mind, then come do it.
Okay, all right, I'll see what I can.
Let's just, I'll make sure.
But like, there was a time I had to teach.
Yeah.
A course for 3 hours straight to teachers, and you know, I did the best that I could, but like I was new faculty, like Dr. Sudbrink is very knowledgeable, but boring. I was on ratemyprofessors.com and so. Anyway, but I know that this is a lot of information. That's what Master Gardener seems to want to load it on. I know. Yeah, so, but you're gonna get to know a lot of things. You don't have to memorize all this stuff, but there are a lot of things that you're gonna see out in the field. And especially, well, once we have drought, we don't see nearly as many insects out. Now that we've had this rain, there should be a series of things that are emerging that we still have warmth and stuff like that. The one thing that, like, if we already gotten that rain earlier in August, we'd had a lot more pest species, I think, in the end of season. This time of year, we're at that point, this weekend's going to be equinox. So a lot of insects note that the day length is even. And so they have a couple little sensors on here. They're saying this, it's going to be winter soon. Many of them will change their interior components to be much more fatty and for overwinter. Some produce their own antifreeze that allow them to survive in cool times. It's kind of there's a sugary base to it that keeps them from freezing out as much. Most insects will die in winter, but there's some of them that are getting ready to overwinter and lay in the leaf litter and stuff like that. A lot of solitary bees are kind of laying in some of that litter. That's why they say not to tear up all the leaves and things like that in your yard. They're going to be seeking places to overwinter and stuff like that. All right, so let's see. We were talking about some of these critters and the things that they do and feed on. Some of these are soil critters. There are other insects that vector diseases. When I talk about diseases in November, we're going to talk about viruses in particular and how a series of insects can carry them within themselves. And in essence, as they're drinking the juice, kind of spit some of that up into the plant and pass on the disease. Sort of the way a mosquito does that with us. They basically will go in there and they'll spit up and suck up and spit up and suck up and pass on whatever virus. Same is true with aphids and other plant sap sucking insects. See here, so basically you can see this leaf does not look very happy. This is probably a variety of watermelon. You can see a lot of this kind of knobbled and stippled structures on there. Formed. Some of them are yellowed. It could be a mosaic type of pattern sometimes with those viruses. But what happened is you had either an aphid or another type of insect that was able to get in there and spread this this virus, and then it just kind of took over parts of that plant. Here's I think this is a common bee, but basically you can see this pattern here. There's a mosaic pattern of virus. Talk about mosaic viruses and things. This is what the color should be, and here is where basically the virus is taking over and reducing the chlorophyll, that part of the plant. And so the insects many times can be the vectors of that. Here's some other, you can see the discoloration occurring on this leaf. And so you can really see that should be a deeper green, and in essence, the virus is taking over the DNA, and forcing it to make copies of itself, not chlorophyll. In that case. There's an aphid, and the aphid itself has got this long kind of digestive tube, and it will run through, its tube kind of coils up, and an aphid will drink a lot of plant juice. A lot of times there's a lot of sugar in plant juices, but they want a little more of the protein as well. So sometimes they will put out these little honeydew droplets to get rid of the extra sugar. I'll talk about that in a minute. In the midst of that, they're also vectoring a virus to the plant. There's an aphid doing just that job right there. Here's a bunch of aphids. So you can see the stylet. This is the feeding tube. So it basically pierces this, and it sends this slender tube in there to start this process of pulling in this plant juice plant sap. And as it does it, it will literally spit up and suck up. And as it does, that's when those viral particles in its salivary glands will spit the virus in, and that's how it can spread to those plants. I don't know. It's a benefit to the virus. I don't know that it necessarily benefits the insect so much, other than it may weaken the plant and make it easier for them to feed on it. There may be some kind of benefit that way. The virus doesn't have a brain. It can't think, but it is vectored by these critters. It has to have other things do its dissemination and spread, and then it will take over those cells. Here's an example of some of that, a viral infection, and this strange rosetting appearance on that of these ornamentals in here. And there's some of the little critters that may vector some of those things. Areophyid mites can cause some of these problems. So it's not just insects, but mites. This looks like a kind of little slender insect, but it's got those little legs at the front. It's like it's a mite, and it will force that plant. It can vector some diseases to that plant as well. Mites and piercing sucking insects can do that same sort of thing. Here's some leaves that have really been seriously damaged. This is a different situation where you've had this kind of basically losing the chlorophyll in the outer edges of the leaves. So this is one species where that's being attacked. So the American plane tree or the sycamore. Here's an oak leaf that this happens to. And so you may see this sometimes, and this is this part of the season where the leaf should be green, but basically this insect is fed on this and caused this chlorosis and necrosis of the outer portions of the leaf. And this is the critter that does it. It's called a sharpshooter. And it's a cousin to one of those ones when I passed that original bag around that had the leaf hoppers in it, just much bigger, and it can vector disease and cause this devastating damage. And this is a bacterial problem. And usually when we get these, is this pretty much terminal for those trees when you get this? Yeah.
The only way you could really do it is to but the insecticides are very expensive.
And so this is going to be a leaf scorch. In essence, sometimes it's called leaf scorch with that. That can be a bacterial vector. Some are viral, some are bacterial, some are fungal, but mostly we're talking bacterial and viral for these things that are vectored by insects. So there's that leaf up. So then, okay, so then she shifts over into another group of critters that can cause problems, the beetles. In this case, again, we're talking about the most numerous of all organisms on Earth, of order of insects. And this is a classic scarab beetle, kind of has this classic scarab shape, and many of them will have antennae that are kind of folded up. They open up in these little plates, and they're really good at smelling where something rotting is, or something where they can go get something good to eat in that, and be attracted to that. Again, the largest order of species of anything in Earth's history. They've got two pairs of wings. The first part is like a hard shell that protects it. Beetles are really good at this. Let's see, a few of these we can see. You can see a shiny one here. They're like nature's little tanks, but with a very kind of lightweight armor. So that if they were like a clamshell, they couldn't move around much. But this system of chitin has allowed them to diversify into more niches than any other critters that we know of on Earth. Many of them can be beneficial, but a lot of them are pest species. Let's see if we can get to that. Again, two pairs of front wings. The back wings are like this wing right here. You don't see this when you're looking at a beetle. It folds up in one of nature's origami tricks. They fold into these multiple little folds like you might see in some tremendously complex origami, and then they fold up under the back of this so they can fit under these protectors. But at a certain point when they're ready to fly, there's a little switch that flips the upper wings open so the bottom ones can kind of fly. And they're not always the most graceful flyers. They're kind of floating around and brook bumping into stuff and stuff like that. There was a movie called Bug's Life, and they had, the big beetle was there. They have some lift, but they're not like a fly. Flies are some of the champions of the flies. These can fly, but they also have a tank shell to them. So that's why they're part of the reason why they're very successful. The back pair of membranous and all that. The mouth parts are generally for chewing, most of them. They go through complete metamorphosis. Here's a lady beetle that you can see. This is the larva of it. So if you ever see one of these on a leaf, that's an immature lady beetle, and they are excellent aphid eaters and stuff like that. They'll eat all kinds of little soft-bodied critters. When they switch into a pupa, that's this quiescent state. You ever seen that? That's what that is. And then there's the adult. And so the adult has the full wing scale. That's the hard wings. They'll pop it open. They can fly from plant to plant. The immatures can't fly, and sometimes it's great to have them on a plant because they're going to mow down every single one of the aphids, as opposed to an adult that might fly around from one to the other. Now, beetles can be beneficial, and they can also be devastating and causing trouble. This is one where beetles have been boring into the wood itself and just been really devastating and damaging. A lot of beetle species can be problems in wood, ornamentals and others. And many times you kind of have to look at the species to see what beetle it might be. They're species dependent many times. There's some of the holes on that one. And there's a group of them called the metallic wood boring beetles that have one in particular that's been causing some devastating results to our ash trees. Buprestidae, the family, their adults can be active during, the warmer months when the frosts are mostly done. They can pupate at a certain point and then cuts a hole in the bark and emerges as adults. Their hosts are hardwoods. There's a series of them that can feed on a variety of different types of trees and cause lots of different dieback and things like that. This one here has a D-shaped exit hole, and that's what I'm going to show in a minute. Here's another species. There's a lot of different kinds of boring insects that will feed on the inside of the bark of these here. That's one of this flathead boring beetle. And so you can see basically the larva will feed underneath of it, and that's the cambium. That's the thing that allows that tree to grow. All that rich photosynthate, and all that stuff is in there in that cambium layer. That's devastating for the tree above it if that thing feeds all the way around. This is one that is devastating ash trees all over Tennessee, particularly east of us and south of us. The emerald ash beetle. It's a tiny beetle. It's not very big. That's a penny. That's how big it is. But a beautiful green color, and flip up the wings, there's a purple color underneath of it. There are other beetles that are much larger, and they're not emerald ash beetle. But this one is causing some devastation. It got out in the port of Detroit in 2002, and ever since has been spreading and destroying ash trees all over the eastern United States. It started out there, kind of moved down the eastern coast, and then got to East Tennessee and has been moving west ever since. This, I don't know, have they reported that in Montgomery County, or is it cheating? Okay. Yeah.
I've had, three companies and loggers paying for maybe more than farmers. I haven't noticed partners. Maybe the children versus the women. I've seen them. We saw crabs one year when we first came out.
Yeah, so this is a species that got out from parts of Eurasia and has literally no natural enemies that occur here. So, and these trees have never experienced this particular species. In parts of Asia, there are ash trees that are adapted to it, and usually it kills kind of older trees. Here, it's killing most of the trees, the vast majority of them. And basically, they lay their eggs. The larvae get under here, and they're gonna feed on that rich cambium sheet that keeps the tree alive, and everything above it starts to flag off and die. Sometimes you will also see these extra kind of stems coming out of the center of the tree, of the sides of the tree. That's sometimes an indicator, and a bunch of woodpeckers flying in these places. That's a classic, unfortunate emerald ash borer damage. Well, it's a tough thing because they're devastating. In individual trees and things like that, you can do some kind of systemic insecticide, either as a root treatment or an injection to the tree that will work its way up the tree and kill the insects that are in the tree. You can get it at home and garden centers and all that stuff. And I've treated some trees, kind of in the backyard with some ash trees with that. Austin P also does that with a series of these ornamental ash trees that are in, say, the Austin P AP bowl. And so they've been treating those at the beginning of the springtime, so that when the tree starts taking up its sap, it gives it some protection. But out in the woods, it's just too expensive to try to do something like that, too overwhelming. And as you drive east in Tennessee, you'll see a bunch of dead ash trees. Well, you won't have to worry about emerald ash borer for a fruit tree. They feed on ash trees. So green ash and white ash and sometimes blue ash. There's a few others. Oh, okay. There's a few ornamentals.
Yeah. I know the golden rain thing.
And so, yeah, so it's this one, emerald ash borer. This may be the first year we get the official, or next year, maybe the first year we get the official, record of it. But the key is it's been in Davidson County and Cheatham County, I guess Dixon, and it's kind of making its way up through here. So, anyway, but that's a beetle that damages the tree's living portion, that living sheet of cambium. And unfortunately, that's very difficult to stop. So those are beetles, and that's a couple. I don't have time to highlight all the beetle species, but that's a particularly bad one that's coming to town, that we're coming to the county. Other species include the true bugs, the Hemiptera. They have the piercing sucking mouth parts like stink bugs, cicadas, aphids, plant hoppers, and a bunch of them. They've got 4 wings that the front ones are kind of hardened, and the hind ones have got some membranous stuff. This one has a half membranous set. So they get some lift that way, but they also have some protective armor to some degree. There's a stink bug, classic, 4 wings folded flat, basically like that. And they've got a variety of things, but they've got a mouth part that says piercing suck. This one is a different critter right here. It's a beneficial in that it likes to eat caterpillars. So this mouth part will invert and it will jab into a caterpillar and start eating the contents of it, drinking it down, keep it up. These are also sometimes called kissing bugs, and they can bite you. So if you see one of those, like you don't want to like handle it because they can possibly bite. If ever I've had one land on me, I've learned to do this, brush off rather than splat, because they can bite, something like that. But most of these stink bugs and stuff aren't going to bite you. They're good for biting plants and not us. Only a few of them can do this, like this wheel bug can do that problem.
I have a question.
Yes, question. Mm-hmm.
So all the bugs you're speaking of tonight, like the beetles and stuff, all these bugs are in Montgomery County now?
Yeah, we have at least representatives of Montgomery County, different species. There's true bugs, there's stink bugs here. There's typical ones here. Right now, we don't have an official record for emerald ash borer, like I mentioned, but there are lots of beetles that cause trouble with trees as well.
Okay, the ones you said that caused the most trouble here, was it the wood-borne beetles? What was the name of it?
Well, if you've got ash trees, then the emerald ash borer is a potential threat to them for sure. But there are many different, just as there are many different species of trees, there are many different species of native insects that feed on them, and most of the trees are okay. The emerald ash borer, though, is an exotic species that the tree doesn't have any defense against, and that's why it's such a problem.
It's called emerald ash borer?
Emerald ash borer, yeah, because it has an emerald color to it, and it feeds on the ash trees.
Ash borer, spell that last part of it.
Like it's boring into it, so B-O-R-E-R, borer.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, no problem. Okay, some of these insects are really good at taking away chlorophyll by basically, or drinking plant juice and other things like that, and removing some of the dark greenness of it. So here, I think is a type of azalea. So in essence, these insects have gotten in here and really fed on and damaged some of that fading color. So there's some real damage there. And this is some of the immatures that do this kind of damage to it, sucking the juice out of it, true bugs. And here's some of the adults. This is called a lace. And so basically they've got the sucking mouth parts underneath them and drinking that plant juice. They also are interesting in that they defend their young, their offspring. These little offspring here, they'll kind of like hang around that and keep predators from feeding them. So azaleas in particular are particularly susceptible to this thing, and you run into problems with that each year. What do you all usually typically recommend for control of those like that?
So I think take something a little bit tougher than insecticides, but I mean, that's usually my go-to, but it's the least residual.
Yeah.
So the bifenthrin, alpine, is one of them. So the general one. Or very after them.
I don't like those are cousins to the azaleas, and sometimes do they attack rhododendrons?
Yeah.
It's in the same family and they can cause trouble. Problem with the azaleas is they're so small that the damage is more noticeable. Whereas a rhododendron tends to have larger leaves. Rhododendron has other problems here in Montgomery County and it's too hot.
Well, liquidity has.
Yeah.
We don't have it active soil. You know, when the plant weeds it, but it's compromised.
Yeah, many times if you have. That's what I mean, like many times, like she mentioned that point, many times if a leaf is starting to turn yellow in some form or other, it means the plant itself is kind of weakened and it gives an insect an advantage. A lot of plants have great chemical defenses. Like anybody who's ever eaten hot peppers knows that. They're chemical warfare, experts. However, and that's when everything's going wrong. If they're kind of feeling, weakened or sickly and yellow and things like that, many insects will focus on that. That's why yellow sticky traps work for a lot of these little flying insects. They're dropping out of the air to go land on that so they can feed on a weakened plant. Because they know that they won't have, say, terpenoids or strong chemicals that will protect them. So anyway, but this is a big problem in azalea, and you can have this kind of, discoloration on the leaves and things like that. So there's those. The Homoptera is a classification that's no longer officially used, but it's a bunch of insects that we kind of know and recognize, and they're part of that same group. The cicadas, like I mentioned, they can either have wings in a roof-like shape, or they can look completely unlike an insect at all. Is this thing? It's like some kind of scale layer that's on top of a plant. Unfortunately, that's a scale insect under, and I'll show that in a second. Here is a little plant hopper, and they're really good at just drinking plant juice. Sometimes they can vector diseases and stuff like that. Let's see. Here's a whitefly, and these are really, really small. You see these little tiny little white puffs floating around, flying around, and then they're going to lay their eggs and become. Their immatures are going to grow something like this. Sometimes they'll even semi-pupate. They're not a true pupa, but they're going to feed on that plant sap of that plant, basically setting up shop. And if you get enough of them, I have a couple of leaves here that have got a bunch of whitefly immatures on the bottoms. There's aphids. Again, they're a sucking insect that cause lots of problems. There's another type of aphid this time of year that causes some issue where the insects themselves, they're drinking a lot of plant sap that's high in sugar, but they want to get more lipids and proteins. So they have to excrete sugar out these two little cornices out the back. That's that honeydew that comes out. And basically, if they sit there and drink plant juice, they just kind of drip this honeydew out. And the sugar water is, ordinarily you would think that would be relatively benign. What it does is it drives the growth of fungi, like this sooty mold on the surface of these hackberries here and others. It's a rich secretion and fungi like it too, unfortunately. So we get some problems with these. And so the ants love it because they get a sweet, sugary juice. All they gotta do is sort of tap the aphid, and the aphid will have these come out, and they tend the aphids almost like their own dairy herd. They're basically taken, this is a mutualism where they benefit and protect their little aphid crop, and then they're drinking plant juice, damaging the plant, The ants are getting the benefit, bring that back and feeding their young. And so let's see, what is it? This is what she put up there. Anyway, that's what she put up there. So, but basically it's not coming out of the rear end, it's coming out of the cornices. So the rear end might put out little droplets of poo. This is actually coming out of here. So that's the incorrect point. Bottom line is it's quite a source for these ants, but a problem. We run into this problem here this time of year. It's a thing called an Asian woolly hackberry aphid feeds on hackberry trees. If you park your car under hackberry trees like mine, you'll have all these little spots on it. That's the honeydew. It's a rich secretion. Unfortunately, it sticks on there and it's hard to get off. You have to. It's from the aphid, yeah. So there's the little aphids, and so here's what they look like. There's the what I think that is. It's like cotton candy coming off of it or something like that. Yeah, they float around. It's a waxy secretion that's supposed to be protective from parasitoids, things like that. But you know, that's what's doing it. And basically they have those two little cornices and they're gonna exude that sap out of it. And that's what you get is something that looks like this because it lands on your leaves or the car and the fungus takes it. That's why you have this black mold on the surface. This is like, there's a section of parking spots at Austin P campus that are under a hackberry. And I just say, I don't care, there's spots, I'm moving to another place because I don't want it all in my car. But that's particularly hackberries are a big problem this year. Other trees can also produce, you know, sap exuding honeydew, but that's the one that kind of kicks into overdrive right now. It would be very expensive and, you know,
Yeah.
What's
it
the
would
tip?
be very expensive. They've been really bad this year. You know, those little critters bite you?
yeah, they actually have the ability to tag you.
They will bite you.
Yep.
But I mean, if it's a smaller tree or it's one that, you know, it's like over your patio where you park your car, I might suggest that people use the net clover.
So it goes
But-
up through the tree and yeah.
You've got to get it on there at the right time, so you're best put it out early, like February, because you get all these ups and downs for it. So it will take it up in the sap, and that might give you something pro. Second thing to do is that if you're not really attached to the tree, a hackberry is not a strong tree, and it's close to your house, hang it over your car, hang it over your patio, you might want to do that when that's close to your house. Because they're not the best tree.
Yeah, hackberry has this kind of warty looking bark and leaves that kind of look like this. It's sort of like these little knobbles all over that kind of look like these little.
Looks like it has warts.
Yeah, that's what I call it. So yeah, there's hackberry and the sugarberry. There's a couple of different kinds that they're cousins, and these aphids love them. These woolly aphids, yeah.
I'm curious, are these Asian woolly aphids the same ones that will line up on like branches and dance in unison?
There's a different species that does that. It's a
Okay.
beautiful thing. Like I've seen it on beech trees.
It took me a
And so
long time.
when
to
you,
get
it's like this whole assemblage of these little woolly, there's a different type of woolly aphid that's on there. And basically when a predator comes up, they all move to kind of mess with the predator. If you have a parasitoid that's coming in, they'll kind of, and like the whole thing undulates, like it's like they're all this kind of like waves of like, don't touch me, don't touch me, don't touch me, you know, it's like that. And so these little wasps are trying to come in and dive on them and stick eggs inside them. And they're like, no, you know, it's all a struggle, you know. in
Or
these-
if you're in that season, then you worry what kind of mushrooms you might have walked through.
But no, I mean, I've seen that several times at, you know, usually it's a little later in the season and it's usually on beech trees, is where I've seen that. And it's just amazing to see all these critters. It's an explosion. It's almost all white across the one stem. They kind of waving and if I can find a video of that afterwards, I'll try to show that. Yes. I don't know. Sometimes ants are known to go for nectar that's coming from the source of that flower. I don't exactly know. There's possibly something there that's exuding honeydew that they're tending. Aphid tending is a very common thing with certain species of ants. All ants don't do it, but some of them do. And they can when you get enough of them, it can seriously limit the production of the plant. But most of the time, it's not that big of an issue. This one on hackberries, that looks so unsightly that this is not a great time of year for, for enjoying hackberry splendor, that sort of thing.
Do they go to other things besides the hackberries, or is this one specific to hackberries?
I think mostly these are hackberries. That we use.
Because I had some little white things all over my shrubs at the front of my house one year, and it left black stuff like that. Like the top leaves all looked green, but when you looked underneath, everything underneath it was black.
Well,
Well,
there
that
are
probably
other
cuts
aphids
you.
that will do that same thing. Aphids can do that same sort of sugar secretion.
Mhm.
All these critters in that group that was called an Homoptera can put that sugar out, and it will produce that honey flow, and then the fungi are like, oh, this is really good. And the spores will feed on that, in essence, reproduce on that. Yeah, the fungi are opportunists when it comes to that stuff. So are the ants, and they're those cute little things that cause so much mess. Then there are these things, these scale insects that don't look like insects at all. They're just like, what the heck is that? Oyster or something, or this weird novelty growth. It's these secretions that these insects are able to produce that protect themselves from predators. This is kind of what it looks like underneath, very stylized drawing, but it's basically this cover that's sometimes wax, sometimes shellac, sometimes something along those lines that is hardened or at least thickened so that this insect in here can just drink plant juice kind of unabated and lay their eggs in here. Eventually, this just becomes a big chamber of eggs. And then those immatures will hatch out and start crawling. So at certain times of year, you'll see these scale insects on there. But usually there's a certain time in the spring when the little critters hatch and start crawling and moving. That's typically the best time to try to control them, not necessarily when this is the case. There's not as much you can do when it's gotten that far. But that's a scale insect, and I've showed some of them are armored or harder scale, like these right here, protective waxy armor, and they don't produce honeydew off of them. Others are, so they don't produce sooty mold in this case. So this hard scale. Others, this is euonymus scale that you find all over euonymus plants at certain times, and they'll set up this kind of waxy secretion on the surface that protects them from predators and parasites. And so there's some of those harder versions of that. So some are lighter colored in their earlier stages, and there's some others that have that hardened structure. Multiple generations. So you can get an April-May flow and a July and an August flow. Have you seen much of these this year with this drought that we've been having?
All about them, but they're usually, if you cut me along with it, usually out.
Yeah, those can be problematic. There's a particularly bad infestation on some euonymus shrubs all over the stems and the leaves too. And they're definitely draining the juice out of that tree. What do you usually?
I think the best way is with the, it wouldn't be so expensive, if you just have one or two breeds of those kind of be a preventative. You gotta remember these systemics, and these don't really, you gotta worry about the systemics in the bees. Horticulture oil.
Yeah.
If you want to go the organic route, but you really have to get it underneath the leaves of the plant. So you may have to go in and do some pruning. We'll talk about pruning in a couple of weeks, but like selective pruning, just to thin it out so it has more airflow going through, and that can help lessen the problem too. So we got cultural and chemical control.
Variety of different things. So, but yeah, there's many different things, particularly ornamentals. There's all kinds of specific species that will feed on those. Here's a soft scale. So it's a waxier type of structure. Underneath, there's that same sort of insect drinking the plant juice. This is much more noticeable when you see that. If you see that on it, those are scale insects. You can clearly see them because they're going to be maybe the size of a pencil eraser or something like that. Definitely sizable. Mealybugs are cousins to those, but not necessarily scale because they can move about a little more. They don't set up the full scale, but they'll put some secretions out to protect themselves too. Okay. So this kind of waxy stuff. Here is the underside of one of the scales after it's laid its eggs, and I don't know if they've hatched yet. Then basically they become this massive sort of egg mass after they've been feeding. And so that's all those little critters, springtime, are going to pop open and start, climbing up the tree and setting or going to other trees and start feeding. When they're on the move, that's when they're most vulnerable. That's when you can take horticultural oil and before, say, you've got bud break and you can put a horticultural oil in and it will smother them, kill them.
Scrape them off and you see them.
You can scrape off scales like at a certain point. Problem is there's many times, many scales. And once you see some, you realize how many that there are. But if it's just one plant, you can pick them off like that. But if you've got a large, canopy of it, it can be sometimes daunting. Yeah, here's some of the more noticeable, the critters, and they can put out honeydew. The soft scales can do that. And in this case, the protective covering isn't separated from the body, so it's kind of an integrated unit. Here's a Lucanium scale. You can see each of these little structures here are scales, and that it almost looks like the color of the branch, but it's really clear. That's not your prize-winning, best garden in Clarksville type of thing, garden club thing. This is that's a consistent bunch, and it'll take a while to control them because in the spring you'll have those crawlers, but that's probably one of the best times to try to control them. You can take them off. Sometimes by the time you see them, they may have already laid their eggs and stuff like that. Ants and wasps will also like to hang out in those because they have honeydew coming out of them. So you'll have a bunch of even wasps and bees will go hang out and drink some of that sweet nectar off of them. There's a very heavily encrusted one right there. And that's some of that. Now here's the mealybugs that you're talking about. So these are more mobile, but they can set up and drink plant juice and have this kind of waxy thing that they exude out their bodies that makes it harder for them to be parasitized and preyed upon. It's not impossible. There's a lot of parasitoids that will attack them. Particularly a couple of different things that are good for parasites for those. But these are common on a bunch of different things. How many have had mealybugs and things like that? So these can definitely become problems. There's several different stages there, some larger ones. And they can drink all sorts of juice and they're going to exude that honeydew as well. There's kind of a hairy, waxy cover that helps protect them. And they can also put that around their egg masses. Sometimes, some places you may have it. Sometimes they're going to just be in the area from other plants and move on to it, depending. Different species of mealybugs, but yeah, they love plant juice. That's what they're going to do. But sometimes you can see them at the store. If you do, sometimes it's good to have a hand lens to look to see. We can see some that look kind of keeled over and that are. I've noticed some things that I leave behind at the garden center too. Let's see. So there's some more. You can see what they're doing on that stem. It's hard to see from the top, but they just kind of put their proboscis in and start drinking that plant juice. There's a long-tailed mealybug. There's citrus mealybug. They're putting out 200, 300 more eggs. That's a lot of reproduction. And it's because a lot of other things eat their eggs. So fortunately, we have things that will go in and start feeding on them. But they stay one step ahead. Like the lions and the wildebeest, predators are only so good, and then they'll just keep on reproducing. With that kind of 600 eggs, that's a lot of reproductive capability. And so you have I think that may be part of the underside of it, showing where the mouth parts are. Anyway, but they're very, very small. They're just like these little white blobs, on the plant. That's just magnified for that case. So that's the true bugs and kind of the damage they do. And we're familiar with caterpillars and the true Lepidoptera. That's the group of the moths and butterflies. Let's see. 4 wings in this case, they're covered with scales. Lepidoptera means scale wings. And so beautiful patterns of scales. All of those things are highly stylized and colored scales. In this case, this one can fold its wings down and be nice and brown. But if a bird comes by, it'll open this up and make it think it's a fox or something like this. Like it's some kind of mammal that it doesn't want to eat. A bird coming in for that, it's like, I don't want any of them, let's fly away. They have some warning colorations that don't really have anything to do with it, but that helps. It's one of the things that species has survived some bird predation from that. Their mouth parts are really interesting. They're not piercing or penetrating and drinking plant juice through the plant. These are good for going into flowers. They have this thing at rest, it curls up. When they invert the muscles of it, it will expand it so that it will go down and feed that. So when they relax, it kind of curls up in this beautiful little spiral. And then they'll go and drink and put their drinking tube down into the plant. They also have some larvae that can be formidable in things like the saddleback caterpillar and others that have these urticaceous hairs. Some of them defend themselves because they're sitting ducks for being fed upon by birds, but they'll have toxins that protect themselves. And those that develop that, they're like saying, don't touch them, you want to pay for that. I've had a saddleback caterpillar. I was walking through a cornfield that had milk vine in it, and it just burned like fire because of the chemical components. Certain caterpillars, you just want to be, leave them alone. If they're really hairy and stuff like that, and looking things like that, that's a good idea to kind of not handle it directly. This one right here makes you think it's really toxic and poisonous, and will even avert these 2 horns out there and make a bad stinking smell. But sometimes it's a ruse, and sometimes it's actually chemical defenses. Caterpillars had to come up with ways because they were mostly rich, food sources, and those that develop these protective things were able to survive. There's the eggs that are just about to hatch. In that case, the larvae emerge and start devouring plant leaves. Sometimes it can really be a mess, like the eastern tent caterpillars. They put those big tents of silk on there. They're devouring all the leaves in their space around there. Chewing mouth parts, really good at doing that. Then there's stuff like the bagworm. This is a pretty bad infestation of bagworm. I don't think I've seen anything ever this bad, but basically they can damage a lot of evergreen trees. Sorry, I'm in the way here. And this is what a bag looks like. Bagworm. So in essence, this is like on a juniper, and they're taking basically parts of that plant and spinning this incredibly thick silk cocoon. And it's so difficult, you have to cut it open. I mean, it's really hard to peel it apart. This is the pupal case that as it emerged out in the adult, there's the adult moth itself. Basically, they'll make a bunch of these, and they're basically kind of pulling off the plant parts to do that. And this must have been I see lots of little bags. This was a heavy infestation. Most infestations aren't nearly this bad with bagworms, but that's one ornamental or ornamental damaging insect. I see them on junipers of several different kinds. In this case, this is like a spruce, I guess. So they'll feed on a bunch of different things, depending on bagworms can feed on a variety of different plants. Let's see, 128 different host plants. So there we go. I think this is called cypress. So there, and you can see they cut this open. That's not an easy task. You really have to have some sharp scissors to get it right, because they made a very dense mat of their own silk to protect themselves. That's a lot. I don't usually see that many on trees and stuff. There is the caterpillar feeding on the actual plant, so kind of munch on that and then set up these, spin these bags when they're ready to pupate. The female dies, the eggs are outside the body in that case, and the larvae emerge and go feed. There's one of the larvae right there. I mentioned the tent caterpillar. This is a common one that we see a bunch of. That's a beautiful little moth, but that's the feeding part of it, and they're feeding on cherries and apples, crab apples, a bunch of different plants, and they can cause a series of things. But they're basically will set up this kind of next to the egg mass. These larvae will keep spinning the silk and kind of continue outwards and denude that tree of leaves. Take them on. That's typically one of the things that you see with that. Is those usually get just spot sprayed, or how do we typically control those? I have not had success controlling them. So.
People say you can break them like when spray them. Just if it's like a branch that you can cut off.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the webworms that are out right now. In the branch, very green and things like that. Don't fortune. Especially at this time of year.
Yeah, it's not a good time. Yeah, it's a bad time to be lighting fires in some woods. We're still in a drought, even though we got 1.5 inches of rain or so. But yeah, tent caterpillars are common. There's some pretty advanced populations there. There are beneficials that feed on them too. So fortunately, there are things that attack them. Again, the insect orders that I mentioned, there's a lot of those, but Hemiptera is the true bugs, Coleoptera is the beetles, Lepidoptera is the butterflies and moths. Diptera is the flies. I don't talk a lot about the flies, but we have some species that will cause damage to plants. Many of them are actually beneficial because they're pollen. A lot of those are doomed. And then Siphonaptera are the true fleas, and then that's a louse there. One of the species that has a lot of beneficials, but some pest species is the wasps and bees, the Hymenoptera. There's a lot of different species in there. It includes honeybees, which are beneficial, and a series of different wasp species that are going to be paper wasps and stuff like that, or others that are pollinators. A lot of these are pollinators as adults. And mostly beneficial. Some of them are predators too, feeding a lot of caterpillars. So we have a lot of benefit from a lot of the Hymenoptera. Some of them are sawflies that can damage things like pine trees and stuff like that. And so their larvae are kind of grub looking, almost like a beetle larva more than a caterpillar larva. The bees have this ability to drink nectar with their kind of proboscis tongue. And they get their name, Hymenoptera, from the Roman god of marriage. And so these, this is the camuli that connect those wings. So basically it's got 4 wings, but 2 of them are connected. So they have one flapping surface. So they're expert flyers, really incredible. Most bees are really, really good at doing that as just one wing surface. They say if they could turn helicopters as efficient as some of these bees, they would be, incredible helicopters, speed, control, all sorts of really amazing flight capabilities. Some of the best flyers, the fly people say they have the best flyers because they have this gyroscopic countermeasure device. There are some very good flying flies, like hover flies and things like that. There is what was called, unfortunately, the murder hornet, but it's just a giant Japanese hornet. And fortunately for us, these have not taken over the United States. Like you heard that back during the pandemic, where he said, what's next? Well, they were able to manage that population that got out of Canada into Northwest Washington, but it is not spread as they had feared. So these are predators of other bees. They like to feed on honeybees and other things like that. And they're pretty large, but in Japan, they will actually harvest them and feed on their larvae because it's a lot of meat. If you saute them, you can make some pretty delicious wasp grubs. Anyway, here in years ago, there were recipes that the Cherokee had of yellow jacket soup. Now that one would be quite a task to get those, but The larvae of those are actually very rich and nutritious. Sorry, I'm going on entomophagy. I got to back off of that. So then you get things like sawflies that are kind of caterpillar-like. This is one that feeds on rose bushes and can be a problem. First start kind of scraping it off and then cutting holes through the whole root. That's the adult right there. So this is a pest species that sometimes can be a problem of some ornamentals. Yeah, there it is, starting to feed on that. And again, we're talking about, spring and early summer types of damage. The larvae themselves drop to the soil and then pupate and emerge as adults in the spring to do the same. This is another hymenopteran species that is now in Montgomery County officially. We have, of course, the ants are part of that group. It's the most numerous of just about anything as far as numbers go are the ants. This one is red-imported fire ant that originally got out in the port of Mobile, Alabama in World War I and spread ever since. We, in my time here at Austin P, we've gone from not being in that zone to now being officially part of the quarantine area. Robertson County just joined that this last year. So fire ants are around, although not as numerous as if you go a little further south of here. But what it means is you can't export turf and other ornamentals and things like that without having it clearly, cleared of fire ants, things like that. So, it's not, I haven't noticed that much in Montgomery County, but I was walking on the Greenway and I saw a few fire ant mounds down there. There's some down in Nashville, obviously. But they kind of marched their way up from the Gulf, up here, taking their time, but it's, with the plant hardiness zones changing, they're gonna move up into Kentucky too, unfortunately. Fortunately, though, there is one, because these are critters that got out from South America. They don't have typical natural enemies. In South America, where they're from, is a place with a lot of flooding. They can make these floating ball rafts of themselves and then move from place to place. But there's this one little fly species that you can see it right here coming after it. And when these little flies, the wing beat has a certain frequency. When these fire ants hear this thing, they take off running because they're dead mortally in fear. Because these larvae will lay their eggs in the head capsule of the ant, and eventually it eats the head and makes the head pop off. The insect world is crazy. There's so many different things, but it's a microscopic, almost micro thing. But that's one emerging from a head capsule of an ant. So the ants, but what it does is it doesn't kill all the ants, but it forces them to not forage as well. And when that's the case, other native species of ants have the ability to forage better. One of my colleagues did his research on that, but it's having some effect, but fire ants keep moving and they cause trouble and you have to be aware of them. If anybody's lived, like I did some of my work, places where there are fire ants and you just have to be aware. You step on that thing with soft ground, you just move away from it so you don't get run up your legs. They're also beneficial in that they control caterpillars, but many people don't really consider them beneficial in that regard. So those are fire ants are part of the hymenoptera. Then the mites are one thing I didn't really spend a lot of time on, but there's a couple of species in particular that are causing problems in ornamentals and others, including the spruce spider mite feeding on spruce, the two-spotted spider mite feeding a lot of crops, and southern red mite. These are little tiny critters that look like a little speck on there, but they're again rasping that surface and feeding and drinking out of that plant juice, kind of scraping it off and causing discolorations and things like that, and eventually causing some real wilting some of those plants. These are related to ticks and spiders, but they are not insects. They have 8 legs typically, and modified piercing mouthparts for feeding on the plant cells. Let's see. So she's got that in here. So the life cycle is eggs, larva, protonymph. You don't have to memorize that, but there's a series of different stages that they go through before they become adults. And they can reproduce rapidly. Spider mites produce this fine little silken threads with which they move about. And it can be a problem sometimes when you get large numbers of them. There's some spruce mites feeding on some evergreen species. definitely taking the photosynthate out, they're just drinking that plant juice and causing this discoloration in that case. There's some more of that kind of discoloration. And these are more active in spring and fall. There's the eggs on it. They're very tiny. That's a spruce needle at the base of it. And those are little tiny eggs on it. So they're really, really small critters. Two-spotted spider mite, it will do something like this. We'll do a discoloration to leaf structures and things like that. If you see this kind of thing, and you look underneath, you see little webbing, it's probably spider mites in that case. And they can go from egg to adult in a little more than a week. It's kind of warm in summer. So, out of control sometimes. Takes them a little long, takes them about a month when it's in cooler months. And there's the little webbing I was talking about. So basically all these little spiders with their mites. And so mites are not focused on feeding other insects, but drinking the plant juice in this case. So we have all these pest species, but there are beneficials, and I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, but there's a species called an aphid midge. This is what that looks like. And they will feed on these larvae. They sneak up on them and feed on them. That's the adult that lays the egg. It wouldn't look like anything at all that would be damaging, but this little critter right here will feed on agents. So we got that as a benefit. That's a fly larva. They have toxic saliva and they paralyze it. That's what these are flipping over. Those are now kind of in suspended animation so that the larva can feed on them. This one is a wasp species that is incredible. The larvae of this are basically this adult will lay her egg inside a caterpillar. This is a hornworm, which you might have recognized from tomato hornworms, things like that. They'll lay an egg in there, but this crazy little virus that comes along with it causes that egg to twin and twin and twin again. So you get multiples of those inside, and then all those little larvae start feeding on the guts of this caterpillar. This would be a fearsome pest of plants, but right now it's not able to do much because the larvae emerged and spun cocoons, and now they're going to go fly out and do the same thing and parasitize these other caterpillars. There are a lot of species of wasps that attack caterpillars. Sometimes they're very clearly demarcated like this, but others are more on the inside that eventually emerge from the caterpillar. And what they're finding is with every species of caterpillar, there's sometimes a unique species of parasitoid that parasitizes. And so if we can manage some of those, we can have some reduction in some of the pest population. And so one of the things that you can do is if you have a diversity of floral components in your gardens, it will attract beneficial insects. So things like wasps and others will be attracted to feed on some nectar and then go and lay their eggs in these caterpillars and feed on those. Well, a variety of different types of things that they recommend that you can use for encouraging those. When I had some colleagues that were at the Rodale Institute up in Pennsylvania, and they had all these different plantings of flowering plants that were in sequence to allow their parasitoids and predators to go after these pests. This one is one of those aphid ones. This is an aphilinid wasp, and basically, this is an aphid, which is very small, a little bit bigger. The female is laying the egg here, and that egg will hatch, grow inside, feed on that little pasty aphid, and then pop out in these things called mummies. And I have a series of those. It's kind of hard to see, but this leaf has some spots on it. Those are all dead aphids that have been parasitized by this wasp. And basically, that's all that's kind of left there. And then when they feed on it, they pop out, and it's a giant hole. It's like there's a wasp inside that eventually grows out, and they can't sting us. That's the best part. These are just great combinations of things that allow those to attack the aphids. There's what it looks like here. Basically, this entire, you can see those were where the little honeydew was coming out. Now this is just a shell, a mummy of an old aphid was devoured by that wasp. So there's a lot of things working for us out there in the garden that we may not see. If we spray them all into oblivion, they don't usually show up as often. They don't show up as much. There's one right there. Here's emerging. So basically coming out the side of it, that's a parasitic wasp. A lot of species of parasitic wasp in the world. There's also questions. So this is an aphid mummy. It's left of the mummy, and that's the cornices that would have put out those
I was
honeybees.
looking at the plant and figure out what.
Oh, that's a bud. Yeah, it's a flower bud. But that's the adult, like the wasp. There's also predator bugs. This is a damsel bug, and they're really good at feeding on caterpillars. That's a cornea worm that it's devouring, sticking its. Basically, what they'll do is they'll stick their proboscis in and just feed on all the fatty tissue on the inside. They kind of scrape it and eat that. And you can get a bunch of those. Ground beetles are very common. They're great predators. They're going to go chew on a bunch of other insects, including slugs and snails and cutworms, cabbage maggots. Here's a larva of one of those feeding on a slug. And there's not much, not much that slug can do. I've seen some of these feed on caterpillars, and there's a bunch of caterpillars. They'll go in and kill one, kill another, and they'll go back and dine on the whole mass of it. They're just like shooting. These caterpillars are like, losing to that particular beneficial. Green lacewings are also great predators. This is the larva of one, and this one has got an aphid in its clutches. It has some really powerful mandibles that are attacking that. This is the adult. They can also feed on them. A lot of different pest species they can feed on. Lacewings are these kind of fine, diaphanous, green, fluttering insects that you may see around in gardens. So the adult is the one that you usually see, but this larva here is beneficial. And a bunch of plants will also attract them too. Lady beetles, as I've already mentioned, there's one of the larvae with the carnage that they've left behind after feeding on those aphids. And a series of different plants that you can plant for that. There's one feeding on cottony cushion scale. Here's a tiny, tiny bug that is smaller than a lady beetle. And they're attacking a lot of different prey, caterpillars and eggs and aphids. They will also sometimes scrape you or tag you too if you get one on you. But they're mostly beneficial, but sometimes they can, like I've had some on my skin that bit me, but not a bad bite. And they're in goldenrods this time of year, a lot of these fall wildflowers. Soldier beetles are also predators. They're going to feed on aphids and caterpillars and things like that. Also pollen, you see them in the flowers too. And then spine soldier bug. This is not a stink bug that attacks plants. Its mouth part doesn't go under like those do. It can push it forward, and that's a caterpillar that is on its way out. Right here, with that sucking mouth parts. They have kind of points on their shoulders, if you will. That's why they call it a spine soldier. That's the difference between that and say a brown stink. Something like that. And then some are parasitic flies that will attack. So this one's one that's going after some caterpillars. This fly will lay her eggs on there, and the eggs are going to start emerging and feeding on those larvae. Let's see if I can pull a little better picture of that. Here are the larvae that are starting to feed on those caterpillars. So one fly can do a lot of damage to a mass of those little caterpillar eggs. And then hoverflies, people call them sweat bees. They fly around. They're non-stinging kind, and their larvae are really voracious, feeding on aphids. Just wade in and kind of eat them. Look like a giant feeding tube, like almost looks like something out of Tremors. If anybody's ever seen that film, that worm, it's like these aphids like they're trying to run from it, but it's too late for those. Other species are wasps that hunt caterpillars. So a series of different wasps will do that and attack them. Some of them, like this is that one that is a spider hawk. I don't know, was this that one that you said stung you, something like this, or is it all black?
No, it was all black.
Okay. But there's some that specialize in spiders. They'll basically parasitize them, paralyze them, take them underground and feed them to their offspring. These caterpillars they're doing the same thing with that. We'll take these caterpillars, feed them to their babies clutched down in their nests on the ground. And some will just eat them outright, but this is the time of year when you see a lot of wasps taking caterpillars back to nests, things like that. And they can, basically it means that the larva will have a chance to feed on that. So I've shown you too many bugs to memorize all of them. I'm probably, that's what you gave me to show on this thing. The key to some of the identification of it is get the basics of it, like the basic groups. Think about that. Is it a beetle? Is it a moth or a caterpillar? Is it a fly or something like that? There are ways to get to the basic orders, and then you can narrow it down. You may also narrow it down to the species that it's feeding. What kind of damage is it feeding on, and the process of elimination. This one right here, this North Carolina State, is a good base source for getting a lot of information about insects in general. These other two links are to the University of Tennessee Soil Lab that does also has at least the place where we're supposed to send pests. Is that still the case?
No, they have big clinics. It's harder to do this diagnostic program. But you can still bring them into the extension office. Usually I can identify them, if it doesn't help a couple other agents or have pollen. But yeah, if you have one that you really want to have identified, it costs $15 plus $10 to send it off. And that goes for diseases too. Plants that have diseases are not quite sure what they are, and you get a diagnosis. You tell you what parts of the plant bring in, all that, and you took it up to the lab and they have to make it for you.
I know this because when I was in grad school, I got to do some IDs for that lab there. But there's a couple. There's one that's a Facebook page for the Soil Plant Pest Center. That's also where you can take your soil samples as well. But those are some basic sources for that. I also wanted to get into one thing that probably it wasn't on her slide set. It has to do with how we try to come up with ways to control different pests. Used to be back in the day when they first came up with these chemical treatments, there's like, we'll just spray that, solve the problem, no problem. Problem was insects reproduce so rapidly in such large numbers that some of them become resistant. Insecticides, some of the offspring are resistant. When that's the case, the next generation is resistant. And so they found that once they would spray, like the first one they really started to find resistance to was DDT. In mosquitoes, they found that they sprayed it and it controlled it, but then some of them survived and passed on their genes. So when they would spray and spray and spray, they would get on this thing called the pesticide treadmill. So you're spraying these chemicals, and the insects are being killed, but some of them are surviving because they can reproduce so dang fast. What they came up with is this technique to try to control it, not just with one technique, the chemical technique, but with a series of different possibilities, trying to combine two or more of these control techniques to try to reduce the pests. Sometimes that's cultural control, sometimes that's behavioral, chemical control, biological control, genetic control, a series of those techniques. But using
That is fascinating. That is very fascinating.
okay, good.
Yeah.
And so integrated pest management is a way to combine a variety of those things. And so some of those include a series of things. Some of them happen when we're not even thinking about it. So keeping pest species that might become major pests out of counties or states or nation boundaries is a way to reduce that. So legislative control is sometimes ways to do that. Others include cultural control, using agricultural techniques that can reduce pest species, like waiting until a certain time to plant wheat so that the Hessian fly can't get it. Mechanical and physical controls can be barriers or mulches or things like that can separate and keep insects from getting in. Genetic control can include using resistant varieties or a variety of other techniques that way. Biological control is all of these insects that we use to control other insects. If you allow predator species and parasitoids, they can help control some of those pests. Notice only one of those is chemical. There's a series of different types of control. If you can integrate at least a couple of these together or more, it's sort of like The analogy like to use sometimes works is baseball. If you're a pitcher and you have a fastball, that's really good. But if everybody knows you're just going to throw a fastball, many times they can hit your pitches. If you've got 2, 3, 4 pitches, you've got the ability to stop the batter. You can basically reduce the chances that they're going to beat you, I guess is the way that is. So combining a variety of these things is one technique in integrated pest management. And it's worked very well in insect pest management as well as plant disease. And they're trying to apply it to some of the weed control, although the weed folks are taking their time learning that. And so, I mentioned the chemical control. I will briefly talk about some of that because some of these chemicals are things that can sometimes be used in organic production systems. So things where you're using sulfur or copper are inorganic compounds. They used to use things like lead arsenate to control things. What could go wrong with putting lead and arsenate in the pest control? Heavy metals were a problem. So that was way back in like the teens and 20s. And they kind of had to stop doing that because it's very toxic. But you can use some combinations of sulfur to control diseases in some insects and some copper as well in there. Some organics still work, and they can be, some of them are registered for organic use. Botanicals. How many have used neem on crops? Things like that. How many have had great, astounding success with neem? Sometimes you get some reduction of them with the neem. Sometimes it's a repellency. Pyrethrin is also interesting. That's actually pyrethrin from pyrethrum related tragedies. Types of marigold types of chemical exudates, very strong ones. There's a type of African pyrethrin that's really good at at repelling insects and causing that. Sabadilla is another one. They're plant-based chemicals that can be used, and they can also be used in organic production. Microbials, the things like that we think about, BT, which is actually a thing that you can buy in preparations and mix and spray out there and only control certain species. Dipel is the name of one of those that controls those tomato hornworms. There's also nematodes that you can purchase that will live in the soil and damage the insects, the pest species underground that are part of that microbials. Safer soap. This is actually potassium fats. Fatty acids, salts, potassium are part of that. And so safer soap is one of the things that is used commonly to try to control some of these soft-bodied insects. It's something that can wash off, and it's not foolproof, as we know. It's not a perfect corrective or things like that, but you can take off a lot of pest species with something like that. And then oils, like we mentioned, horticultural oil is one technique that can also be used to do that. So those are 5 different kinds of insecticide chemistries that at least some phases of them can be used in organic production. There's another one that has organic in its name, but it's not for organic agriculture. So synthetic organics, things like pyrethroids, carbamates, neonicotinoids, and things like that, are those made from carbon, hydrogen combinations that are for controlling insects. However, they are some of the ones that insects have become resistant to over time. And some of them are quite toxic and have to be handled with great care, including making sure that we read the label every time. Anytime you're doing anything with mixing, even organic compounds, you want to make sure you follow according to the directions, only use as is labeled and listed. Because, there are ways, these are toxic compounds, and sometimes they're in concentrated form. Mostly at the Home and Garden Center, they're not too crazy, but there are some that are hot, but the ones that are restricted use can really be toxic. And so when you're doing that, you have to follow all those things. You may have to wear a series of things, like with some of those extreme chemistries, you're using gloves, Tyvek suit, respirator, goggles, and all those sort of things. But most of the ones that you're purchasing at a Home and Garden Center are relatively simple to use. But there are ways that we can mess up. We can put too much of these out there. That's one of the problems. Homeowners like, if an ounce will work and a whole pound's going to work, and you're going to spray way too much out of the thing, you're going to overkill and cause other problems to not only the environment, but also yourself. some of these insecticides can come in through our skin, and so we want to make sure we're protected from that. And so, but anyway, but following this label, it has all kinds of good, important information as to how it's formulated, what the active ingredients are, whether the inert ingredients, always keep out of reach of children, and then how to use it, how soon you can go back to the field, what is the best way to store and dispose of it, and those things. Have you all talked about pesticide labels?
No.
Yeah, okay. So this is just the basic thing, but any product that you get that is for that, it's the law that you have to follow the instructions, because you can make a mistake and cause toxicity problems with, with others and things like that. There's one horror story that came out of Mississippi. I did some of my work there. They used this methyl parathion inside a house to control pests. That's a problem. It's very toxic and and caused people to be very sick. People that did it faced prosecution and did time. So mostly we're not dealing with that with any of these home and garden center things, but we want to make sure that if we're having to use some of them, that we're reading according to the label and only putting out what needs to be put out when it needs to be put out. And one final thing is that I've talked about a lot of pests and probably scared you into everything's going to eat our crops and gardens and stuff like that. However, many times a little bit of damage is not so bad for the overall plant. It may be physiologically unimportant or damaging to the actual crop. So just one bug doesn't necessarily mean that you have a big pest problem or just a few insects. However, if they reach this point of economic injury level, to this point where the pest species are in abundance, that are going to cost a farmer the crop that they're going to serve, that's when they have to treat that at that point where the cost of the level of injury, where the cost of damage equals the cost of control, economic injury level. To reach that point, though, you have to look at it and monitor those crops. To do that, it may mean getting out and looking at your crop. So monitoring the fields is important, whether that's doing visual observations, which most of us do in the garden, or actually using a thing like a sweep net, where you go through a crop field and you're kind of going down a row with a steady sweeping net like this, and you're going through vegetation, and you pull out about 25 of those. If you have a certain amount of insects in there, that may be enough that merits a control. Others include using a drop cloth and shaking vegetation to see insects that might drop out. There's a series of different kinds of ways to observe them. And if the insects are in abundance, then, and abundance at a point where they're causing a damage that's going to be economic, then is when you try to treat and spray. Not if you just see a few. Used to be they would see one and they just spray the whole field. And there's a problem with that, because all those beneficial insects, when you spray them, you can take them out and they're not going to be able to do the jobs that they might ordinarily do. So the spiders and the parasitic wasps and the lady beetles. If we can, sometimes with the cropping, if we can postpone some of those treatments, we can allow natural enemies to do their job and may not even have to spray at all. But sometimes we get to that point where we actually might have to treat. This is an example of it. So look at this as the number of pests, insects in the field monitored at several weeks. So you go out there and you take a sweep net and you get pest populations that are relatively low. Even here, they're still below the economic threshold. If they're below it, there's no need to spray, no need to incur the excess costs. Pesticide saves green for the environment, saves green for your wallet. You don't have to do it. But at a certain point, you may get a pest population that reaches or exceeds the threshold and gets the economic injury level. That's the case. Many times, at least in larger agricultural fields, they will spray and treat then. But it comes down to, in many cases, weeks of scouting to determine, do you actually have a pest problem? Once it gets to that stage, then they might treat it. And here the treatment was applied, population declined, and then it kind of came back up later in the season, you had to treat it again. This is more on larger scale agricultural settings, but we use this process of looking to see what the pest population is first before we just automatically spray. Back in the day, people would say, it's April, I'm going to spray this. but every season is different. And your crops and things like that, the plants that you've got may have different populations based upon your observations that you can see of it. It's getting out into that thing and putting eyes on it to see what the populations are. Each crop kind of has its own economic thresholds, levels and things like that. And I don't know, there's probably guidelines for that. I don't know what UT recently has for regarding, yeah, highly variable for pests and things like that. But it's the theory behind it that's actually practically usable. And it's helped us to reduce pesticide exposures and preserve some of those natural enemies to help that. Sometimes though, there's no substitute. If you're trying to protect an economic crop, you may have to spray and treat. That's just the way it goes. But that's kind of summation. That was a part that she didn't have in her talk, this pest management stuff. Integrated pest management, I'll probably talk about that when we talk about the plant disease side of it, because integrated pest management can be applied to many of those pest species. Anyway, so I've got a whole bunch of stuff that you've had a chance to see. I've talked too long, but are there anybody have questions about any of the insects or critters or these species that are causing issues? It's 9 o'clock almost, so I'm sure everybody's ready to go. But thank you for bearing with me here, and I appreciate your attention. I'll see you all in November. I guess it's November the potluck too. Is that the last one? Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll feed you.
All right, I'll look forward to that.
Sorry.
No problem. No, I brought some stuff.
Okay, thank you.
Anyway, no problem. Thank you all. And
Thank you very much.
yeah, and also let's see. So if we can go back, like you can go back to
Whoops, I'm sorry.
my stuff is my email is sudbrinkd
Okay.
at apsu.edu. That's how, if you have any questions about any of the things I talked about, courses and stuff like that, that's my contact.
Okay.
Thank
And
you
this-
so much.
No problem, no problem.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your attention, bear with.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, we'll see you all next week.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Bye.